On February the 27th, 1996, Japanese gamers were introduced to two new titles that would change their lives forever. Pocket Monsters Red and Pocket Monsters Green for the Game Boy were the first opportunity players had to get to grips with the Pokédex, gym battles, and whatever the hell Mr. Mime is. They were such a big hit that the games were sent out to the rest of the world, starting a global love affair with the franchise now known as Pokémon. Since then, the series has expanded into every single nook and cranny of popular culture in a way that few other video games have. Pikachu could announce it was running for president, and in all honesty, it would stand a fairly good chance of winning. That is where we're at here.
It's important to remember that amongst the movies, TV shows, and piles of plastic crap, Pokémon is, at its core, a game franchise. There's the best part of 100 games out there, and it's about time somebody sat down to separate the Mewtwos from the Magikarps. I think this calls for a ranking, don't you? First, a few disclaimers. We're only counting games that got a console release, so no mobile titles, with one notable exception. Sorry, Pokémon Sleep and Pokémon Smile. No online browser games, and no arcade cabinets here. We're also not counting anything that was only available on the Pokémon Mini handheld or the Sega Pico edutainment system, because those are for children, and children, as we all know, don't count, or can't count, unless they've been using an edutainment system, I guess. I don't know.
Caught all of that? Then let's rank 'em. I'm Ben.
And I'm Peter from TripleJump, and this is every Pokémon game ranked from worst to best.
The Unrankables. The issue with Pokémon being a Japanese franchise is that sometimes reviews for games in English can be quite hard to come by. We tried to force Ashton to sit down and learn the language, but that just made her cry, so we decided to stop. What a wuss! This prefix to the main list bundles together a few games that we just couldn't accurately rank, but deserve a mention anyway. First up, we have the Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Adventure Squad series for the Wii. In 1993, the first Mystery Dungeon game was launched in Japan as a roguelike spin-off of Dragon Quest IV. In the years since, the series has branched off onto many other paths, including a Chocobo series inspired by Final Fantasy, and a selection of games including, you guessed it, Pokémon. Most Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games have been released to Western audiences, with the notable exception being the 3 in the Adventure Squad series. They're called Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Keep Going Stormy Adventure Squad, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Keep Going Blazing Adventure Squad, and Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Keep Going Light Adventure Squad. You can see why they never made the journey over. Would be an absolute nightmare to fit those names on a passport. Video games need passports, right? Yeah? So. These titles, which I will not be saying again, were released as WiiWare exclusively in Japan. As a result, reviews in English are incredibly hard to find, which means we can't include them on the full list, but I can tell you that each one had its own unique set of dungeons to explore, focused on a different type of Pokémon, and put their emphasis more on gameplay than plot. If you want to sample these titles for yourself, then good luck, because the Wii Shop shut down in 2019, taking all traces of the Adventure Squad series with it. You could still access the games through naughty means, but we here at TripleJump would never condone anything like that. Winks at audience. Oh god, no, that was a stage direction. Another Japan-only title, Pokémon card game How to Play DS, was, you'll never believe this, a title that showed you how to play the Pokémon card game on the DS. I know, right? Mind-boggling. This was the third in a series of handheld games based on the card version of Pokémon, as opposed to the much more exciting iteration where you get to watch made-up animals punch each other. The other two card-playing titles did alright, but what about this one? Well, I have absolutely no idea. Reviews from reputable outlets are basically impossible to find, with IGN's page about the game being helpfully empty, and even Pokemon's fan wiki only including a few lines about the 5 CPU enemies in the game. There's also no gameplay footage online, which makes our lives so much harder. A huge sarcastic thanks to everyone who couldn't be bothered to do a Let's Play. Come on, guys! From what little info there is out there about how to play DS, it seems as if it's nothing more than a glorified digital rulebook with a worryingly small number of AI opponents for players to face once they've read everything. Perhaps we now know why there's never been another card-based Pokémon game for home consoles. This one killed the series dead. Although it could also have been that people genuinely aren't interested in the card game anymore. Oh, no, wait, the world is terrible. And finally, we have Pocket Monsters Stadium from 1998, which as it turns out is not the same as the first first Pokémon Stadium game Western players would get their hands on a year later. Released for the N64, Pokémon Monsters Stadium was the first in the Stadium sub-series, which we'll be seeing a bit more of later, that allowed players to hop on a more powerful console and let their favourite colourful blobs smack each other around on a TV screen. In 3D, no less. Ooh. Apart from having one of the busiest covers in video game history, dear God, there's a lot going on there. Information about this game written in Latin characters is very hard to find. GameSpot said the game got 1.4 million pre-orders, whilst IGN reported that it only sold 270,000 copies in its first week. It isn't even acknowledged in the series numbering system, as the first Western version got labelled as Pokémon Stadium and was presented like it was the first one. Pocket Monster Stadium remains one of those mystical video games that was a victim of a time where globalization wasn't what it is today. Maybe one day, an English version of it will find its way onto one of Nintendo's online libraries, but for now, it remains a fond memory for Japanese gamers only, and the rest of us will just have to live with that. Phew, okay, you guys ready? Good. Now on with the main event. Number 90. Pokémon TripleJump main system, 3DS and 3DS XL. Our list proper begins in 2007 when a Pokémon arcade game developed by Takara Tomy and AQ Interactive called Pokémon Batrio was unleashed in Japan. It involved scanning pucks that each represented a different Pokémon and then battling against your friends to see which one of you had spent the most money on small pieces of plastic. Batrio was followed up by Treta 5 years later, and then in 2013 the arcade title Pokémon TripleJump got ported to the Nintendo 3DS. Well, sort of. Pokémon TripleJump main system was an application included on an accessory for the 3DS and 3DS XL that allowed players to scan their pucks at home. 3 new pucks for Eevee, Mewtwo and Lucario were launched alongside it, and first editions also came with a puck for Pichu. No, I didn't misspeak. That's Pichu, the unevolved form of Pikachu, because that's clearly the Pokémon everyone wanted for first editions. This add-on set buyers back 3,800 yen. It was only released in Japan, you see, or roughly $28 in today's money. That's quite a lot for a product that was discontinued after a year and only worked with an application that was removed from the eShop in 2017. Pokémon TripleJump main system was rated fair by users over at GameFAQs, but considering its short lifespan, relatively high price point, and the fact that it was basically just another way to get kids to spend money on useless tat, we're not its biggest fans. Number 89. My Pokémon Ranch, Wii. Once available for download from the selection of WiiWare on the Wii, My Pokémon Ranch from 2008 gave users the ability to transfer their favourite critters out of their copies of Pokémon Diamond and Pearl and onto, well, a ranch. Hang on a second, don't ranches usually hold animals that are being bred for slaughter? Oh god, this is all one horrible trap. Run, Piplup, run! Thankfully, there is not a game mode for My Pokémon Ranch that allows you to find out what roast chimchar tastes like, and that's not the only plus point to this game. Players don't even need a copy of Diamond or Pearl to play it, as they're granted 6 Pokémon at the start and given a new one at the beginning of each day. Aw, that's a nice touch, but unfortunately, we are now out of plus points. Whilst players are able to interact with their favourite creatures through their Miis, they can't actually do anything with them. There are no mini-games to play, no tasks to be done to keep the Pokémon alive. You could look at them and take pictures of them, and that was basically it. Reviewers hated the game, with some likening it to a screensaver. I would go as far as to say that this is worse than a screensaver, as at least you can click away from those and something more exciting will appear. No such luck here. Number 88. Pokémon Box, Ruby and Sapphire, GameCube. 4 years before Pokefans across the globe were being bored to tears on the Wii, Pokémon Box Ruby and Sapphire was offering a similar experience on the GameCube. Once again, this game was marketed as extra storage space for your main Pokémon title, although this one was compatible with Ruby and Sapphire and Fire Red and Leaf Green. 4 different games? Now that's what I call variety. To give this thing, which really should have been called Pokémon Cube now that I think about it, some credit, it did allow players to breed Pokémon, something that the Ranch was unable to offer, and through the GameCube Game Boy link cables it also supported playing handheld Pokémon games on an actual TV. Whilst that's commonplace nowadays in the era of the Switch, a revelation like this back in the good old GameCube days would have likely caused several instances of self-soiling amongst the Nintendo faithful. Messy underpants to one side, there really isn't much else to say about Pokémon Box. It's not even really a game if we're being honest, just an addendum to an existing title with an admittedly cool party trick. It was clearly designed to appeal to those who took playing Pokémon very seriously, which wasn't a small number of people in 2004, but it also wasn't large enough to make any sort of real splash on the wider gaming world. Reviewers at the time agreed, labeling the software nice, but ultimately unnecessary. Number 87. Pokémon Dash, DS. One of the main criticisms leveled at Pokémon as a series is its lack of variety. In the main role-playing games, you get your starter, do your best to fill up that Pokédex, and collect gym badges as you traipse around your chosen region, interacting with all the locals who can mostly just say 1 or 2 lines of dialogue. It's not like Game Freak and the Pokémon Company haven't tried to branch out over the years, it's just that when they do, we sometimes end up with games like Pokémon Dash. Starting life as one of the DS's launch titles, Pokémon Dash is a racing game where players compete to find out which pocket monster is the speediest of them all. Maybe it should have been called the Fast and the Furret-us. Get it? Because Furret is a Pokemon. No, never mind. Actually, scratch that awful joke, because players can only race as Pikachu, which seems like a massive oversight from a series that has hundreds of recognizable characters by this point. Also, the gameplay consists almost entirely of swiping the touchscreen with the stylus, which has got to be one of the dullest ways of getting repetitive strain injury I've ever heard of. Whilst not a bad idea on paper, Pokémon Dash was lazily executed. Speaking of executed, if you command your Pikachu to swim out into deep water, it'll drown. How this game got an E for everyone rating, I'll never know. Number 86. Pokémon Rumble U, Wii U. The Pokémon Rumble series began life on the Wii, so it makes perfect sense that when the console got a successor in the Wii U, a new Rumble title should follow. Unfortunately, due to the naming convention of the hardware, this game sounds like the titular Pokémon are coming to rumble you, and you specifically. I'm not entirely sure what being rumbled entails, but I am sure that I don't want a Snorlax to do it to me. In terms of gameplay, there isn't much difference between this game and its predecessor. Players take control of their chosen champion, in this case either Pikachu or the Gen 5 starters to begin with, and compete in various arena stages, wiping out lower level enemies before taking on a big scary boss at the end. Scary because of its weird proportions more than anything else. There's an attempt at a story which casts the Pokémon in question as toys that are trying to get back to a shop, but that raises far too many questions about existentialism to be dwelled on for too long. As much fun as sending wave after wave of grunt Pokémon to their doom is, Rumble U gets incredibly repetitive incredibly quickly. If you're after some mindless fun, then maybe you'll get on with it, but there just isn't enough substance to keep you coming back for any other reason. Also, it has some toys to life elements to it. Hooray! Our favourite. Number 85. Pokémon Channel, GameCube. Rather than being a TV station playing non-stop clips of Brock trying to flirt with Nurse Joy, Pokémon Channel is instead a game for the GameCube that allows you to purchase your very own Pokémon in just 4 low monthly installments. Okay, not really, that would be an awful idea. Imagine the mess, both to your home and your credit rating. The actual story is that Professor Oak is attempting to start a new Pokémon-themed TV channel and wants the player to test it out. Then the player meets a Pikachu, who also gets roped into the focus group. Then Pikachu destroys the TV, and then there's something about a missing episode of a fake anime, then new shows start spawning on the channel out of nowhere. What on earth is going on? These wacky plot points were an attempt by developers Umbrella to distract from the fact that, at its core, Pokémon Channel is quite threadbare. The main crux of the game is watching TV and participating in the various shows, which are decently varied, encompassing everything from an art show to a quiz to a news channel, but none of them are all that exciting. Considering that each day in the game lasts an actual day in real life, anyone who was unfortunate enough to lay down money for a copy of Pokémon Channel quickly found themselves reaching for the actual remote instead. As it turns out, sitting in front of the TV with a yellow mouse next to you isn't a very exciting premise for a video game. Who knew? Number 84. Pokémon Battle Revolution, Wii. Throughout this list, you'll see plenty of examples of games that take the traditional Pokémon battle formula and make that the focus, only this time the battles take place in giant arenas instead of glorified sports centers. Pokémon Battle Revolution, which released for the Wii in 2006 and 2007, is one of these games. Sadly, it's the weakest one. Set during the 4th generation of the series, Battle Revolution takes place in a special theme park with 11 unique arenas to fight in. The park is called Poketopia, though I'm not sure anywhere with coliseums designed to hold what are essentially fights to the death can be counted as a utopia, especially not for the poor critters doing the fighting. I hope they got to go on some roller coasters before they were slaughtered. Whilst there are plenty of different stages in which to wage war in this game, that's the only thing players can do with it, as there is no story mode. In fact, there's barely anything for a single player to do at all, which was the focal point of some of the title's criticism. Yes, it was cool that you could link up your DS to the game and transfer Pokémon over Diamond and Pearl, but this handy feature was not enough to overcome the shallow gameplay, poor online support, and overall emptiness. Battle Revolution? More like Battle Devolution? Am I right? Am I right? Please tell me I'm right. Number 83. Pokémon Shuffle. 3DS. Instead of being a fun dance where you put your hands on your head and waggle around like Psyduck, Pokémon Shuffle is instead a puzzle game released on the Nintendo 3DS in 2015. If someone does want to choreograph that dance for us, by the way, then we'll be more than happy to force James to do it for you. As you'll see later on, some of the Pokémon puzzlers are really good, outscoring some of the actual mainline games in certain areas. Unfortunately, Pokémon Shuffle is not one of those games. Whilst the story sees the player character battling a series of pokey opponents, the actual gameplay involves arranging little icons into groups of 3 to make them disappear. Sounds like something you'd see on a mobile game. What's that? Pokémon Shuffle was released on iOS and Android 6 months after the 3DS release. Oh, suddenly this is all making sense. It gets very boring very quickly, and whilst the art design is cutesy and there has at least been some effort made to tie everything together with a plot, there's nothing to this title that will keep you entertained for longer than about 15 minutes at a time. Somehow, the mobile version scored better on Metacritic than the handheld one did, which is utterly insane. When you've come second to a game that includes microtransactions, then maybe it's time to admit defeat. Turns out this would have been better as a dance after all. Number 82. Pokémon Rumble Blast. 3DS. Another entry in the Rumble sub-series, Blast burst onto the 3DS scene in 2011. Well, I say burst, what I actually meant was crawled slowly, coughed a bit, and then collapsed in a heap. We're back in Toy Town for another adventure with Pikachu, only this time he comes to life when somebody winds him up with a key, which is actually how I start my day here at TripleJump Towers. This plays a key, pun intended, part in the narrative, as Peaks and friends must defeat an evil key called Dark Rust that has prevented the World Axle from creating the glow drops which are essential to life in the town. Wow, that is some deep lore for a game where toy Pokemon come to life. The story element bumps Blast ahead of its Wii U sibling, but outside of that, there isn't much to shout about. The gameplay is just as repetitive as we discussed earlier, full of short levels that don't offer much in the way of excitement, and some critics claimed that it should have been released as a piece of 3DSware rather than as a full game, which is damning no matter how you slice it. At least the developers at Umbrella tried to make this title more interesting with a high-concept plot, but maybe they should have spent less time on that and more time on making the game, actually fun to play, just a thought. Number 81. Pokémon Rumble World. 3DS. Oh man, I really hope we don't have too many fans of the Rumble series watching this list, because it has not done very well, has it? 4 years after Blast and 2 years after U came Pokémon Rumble World, also for the 3DS. Like previous games in the series, Rumble World is set in a land where your favourite Pankymans are walking, talking toys. This time, the player is given a Pikachu owned by the King, who wants you to go out and catch other Pokémon for his collection. Why he can't do that himself, I'm not sure. Maybe he's too busy riding horses or eating turkey directly off the bone or whatever it is kings actually do. Either way, you've got a Pikachu now, and it's time to do some toy hunting. As well as the same boring gameplay that plagued the other Rumble entries, World also has the unfortunate status of being a freemium game, meaning that real money could be spent to purchase items and in-game currency. Whilst most add-ons could be purchased fairly easily using the funds accrued through gameplay, the spectre of microtransactions still looms over this title. Once again, there is only so much we can say about a game that, at its core, isn't very fun to play. There's still one more Rumble game to come, so maybe we'll like that one. Spoilers, we won't. Number 80. Hey You, Pikachu. Nintendo 64. The first game on this list to feature punctuation, "Hey you, Pikachu," is clearly a good game because someone deemed it important enough to warrant an exclamation mark. Professor Oak has developed a new device called the Poke Helper, and he wants the player to test it for him, presumably so he doesn't get hurt if it accidentally explodes. The Poke Helper is supposed to let humans and Pokemon communicate with one another, and who better to try this out on than everybody's favourite zappy little rodent? The main marketing point of "Hey you, Pikachu" was that players could talk to the mascot through the use of an N64 add-on called the Voice Recognition Unit, or VRU, which registered voice commands and translated them into game inputs. The The VRU was specially designed to be more compatible with high-pitched voices, such as those belonging to small children, which was Nintendo's subtle way of shaming you for playing Pokémon games as an adult. If players could get the VRU to work, the game requires them to take part in various tasks alongside Pikachu, including gathering food or fishing for 365 in-game days, at which point they must release their friend back into the wild. Bloody hell, that's a bit emotional for a kid's game, isn't it? Have we not learned from the Butterfree incident? Whilst there's a certain novelty to this game, the tasks are mediocre at best, and thanks to some dodgy new technology, "Hey you Pikachu!" is ironically nothing to shout about. Number 79. Pokémon Rumble. Wii. Here it is, everyone, the game that started it all for this list's least favourite subcategory of Pokémon games, 2009's Pokémon Rumble for the Wii. And wouldn't you know it, it's also not done very well. I'm beginning to think this series is cursed. There's not really much we can say about the original Pokémon Rumble, as the gameplay basically never changed in any of its sequels. You take control of a toy Pokémon, you fight waves of enemies using your moves, rinse and repeat until the game ends or your fingers fall off, whichever comes first. The OG gets some points for being the first title to utilize this format, but players saw through its paper-thin premise right from the start. Whilst mindless fun can be, well, fun, Pokémon is a series that is inherently built on strategy, choosing which combination will serve you best in certain situations and putting the work in to make your team the very best, like no one ever was. Rumble has none of these elements, instead feeling like a completely different game somebody slapped Pokémon sprites on top of at the very last minute. Had the series stopped after one entry, then maybe it wouldn't be looked back on so harshly, but the fact that it spawned 3 sequels and a mobile exclusive title in 2019 doesn't help its reputation at all. At least, we can finally stop talking about it now. What a relief. Number 78. Pokémon Play It, version 2. PC. Pokémon Play It! Oh, alright, we'll stop doing that now. Version 2 is, as you may have worked out, the second in the Play It series. It was released in the year 2000 for Windows PCs, and once again focused on the card game version of Pokémon that we all definitely understood how to play and definitely didn't just take part in to look at the nice pictures. Wannabe carders, I'm fairly sure that's what they're called, can either take on special challenges, play against Julie, the game's resident AI character, or be taught the basics of the card game through the handy help feature. There are some things that this game can't help you with though, such as how to make friends in real life or how to get those kids at school to stop wedgieing you. This version of Play It fixed a couple of issues from the first game, including the ability to put cards on the bench, and got rid of its non-interactive tutorial components, but it is still ultimately a video game about playing a card game, and there's always a ceiling on how good those can be. Sorry to any fans of Virtual Solitaire out there. Play It version 2 is not going to change your life, but if you have fond memories of carding the heck out of your friends during the break in between double maths, then you might get something out of it. Number 77. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Darkness, DS. The least appealing Pokémon Mystery Dungeon game that we could actually understand the reviews of is one half of a pair of adventures that first debuted in 2007. Because why sell fans one game when you can sell them 2 and double the profit, right Nintendo? Explorers of Darkness was part of the second wave of Pokémon Mystery Dungeon and the 4th generation of the franchise overall. Players start the game by discovering that they have been turned into a Pokémon which they could choose from a list of 16 before striking up a partnership with another pocket monster. It's then time to explore underground caverns, battle with baddies, and save the world from a very Pokémon plot involving special gears that control time and space. You also go to the future, essentially making you the Pokémon version of Doctor Who. Doctor Chew? Doctor Chew? Yeah? Critics said that both games had a decent story, but lacked enough variation to keep players around to see it to the end. On the whole, there isn't a great deal of difference between the two titles, with the choice of Pokémon players can encounter being the main one, but the consensus with reviewers and with players online is that Explorers of Darkness was the lesser of the pair. Ultimately, your preference will probably come down to which one you had as a kid, but without the powerful pull of nostalgia, there won't be much reason for you to pick up any of them as an adult. Number 76. Pokémon Play It, Windows. If you were lucky enough to have a copy of the 2-player CD-ROM starter set of the Pokémon trading card game, then you will be aware of the original Pokémon Play It title, which was part of this collection. If you weren't lucky enough to own this set, then you're clearly not a true Pokémon fan and should stop watching this video right now. Okay, please don't go, we actually really need the views. Click the like button too, we worked so hard on this. In a similar vein to its successor, Play It Cool Original Flavor is a digitized version of the Pokémon trading card game, or TCG for the acronym fans out there, which also released for Windows in 1999 in Europe and 2000 in North America. There are 3 different sections to the game. Play, where players can take part in full-length card battles with CPUs. Learn, where they could brush up on their knowledge. And Extras, which included a special Academy entrance exam quiz, which I'm being told is not a substitute for a real degree on a job application. Rude. Reviews of both Play It games were not easy to find, but the general consensus was that the first one was ever so slightly better than the second. If you were crazy about the TCG at the time, then this was probably a sacred text, but we're here to talk about real video games with real fighting and stuff, so forgive us for committing this minor bit of blasphemy. Number 75. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Gates to Infinity. 3DS. 3 years after the last Mystery Dungeon game was released to Western audiences, fans of the series got something new in the form of this one for the 3DS. It's called Gates to Infinity, which I know is technically grammatically correct, but I also can't shake the feeling that it should have been called Gates of Infinity. Anybody else know what I mean? Or have I finally lost the plot? Actually, don't answer that. In a break from tradition, Gates to Infinity was not released as part of a pair, instead standing on its own. Did this result in a better end product as the development team at Spike Chunsoft only had one job to do? Well, no. Not really. The game followed a similar formula to previous titles. Player wakes up as a Pokemon, has to explore dungeons to work out what's going on, etc. But all the fun bits came far too late into the narrative, by which point players will have likely lost interest due to mind-numbingly repetitive actions and a patchy plot. Once it does get going, it's not too bad, as the story plays around with the whole person being turned into a Pokemon thing to a way deeper degree than any of the other Mystery Dungeon games. Unfortunately, by the time you're able to sink your teeth into the meatiness, you'll be wishing you'd decided to play something else instead. Maybe making 2 games at once was actually the way to go. Number 74. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time. DS. Speaking of 2 Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games at once, here's the second half of the pairing with Explorers of Darkness. And what's the opposite of darkness, I hear you ask? Well, according to this game, it's time, which doesn't make any sense at all. Explorers of Time was also released for the DS back in 2007 and also put players into the shoes of a person turned Pokemon. Wait, do Pokemon even have shoes? I'll get back to you on that one. Mr. Mime does. Both games had exactly the same plot, which revolved around time going a bit wacky and the player character and their team needing to sort it out, but there were differences in the types of creatures that were available to join you on your quest. Explorers of Time boasted exclusive Pokemon like Celebi, Pachirisu, and Lucario, and whilst Explorers of Darkness allowed players to interact with Mewtwo, other tepid exclusives like Burmy, Rotom, and Buneary seriously weighed it down. Perhaps this is why Time did ever so slightly better with critics, but unfortunately it wasn't safe from the same accusations of boring gameplay and poorly scripted dialogue, which is why it finds itself towards the bottom of our ranking. As is the case with every pair of Pokemon games, your preference will vary depending on which version you were bought for Christmas. We can only be so objective, so please don't take your frustrations out on our families. They did nothing wrong. Number 73. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky. DS. Just when you thought you were safe from Mystery Dungeon games with the suffix Explorers of something, another comes right at you. They'll get us all in the end. Sorry, that went a bit far. I'll calm down now. As is the case with some of the main Pokemon games, Explorers of Darkness and Time were accompanied by a third, so-called enhanced version a couple of years later. This was called Explorers of Sky, and yes, that doesn't make much sense grammatically either. The plot in Sky is largely the same as the other games, but there are some subtle differences to keep players on their toes. As well as new items that look similar to existing ones but have different abilities, this version also contains more Pokemon, including the mighty Shaymin, who is more powerful than it looks, I promise. This was always going to be a controversial one to rank, as opinions on it vary wildly depending on who you ask. Critics were not fans of it at the time of its release, with several outlets going as far as to call it a rip-off. However, in recent years it's obtained something of a cult following, with praise going to its story, soundtrack, and gameplay. We've tried our best to incorporate all these views into this placement, but no matter what we did, we were always going to make someone angry. Go on, get it all out of your system now. We can handle it. Number 72. Pokémon Cafe Remix. Switch. Pokémon Cafe Remix, or Pokémon Cafe Mix if you want to get pre-October 28th, 2021 about this, is another title that found a home on a console before getting a much wider release as a mobile title. It was available for one day as a Switch exclusive before getting released worldwide to phones, to which I ask, why? According to Wikipedia, Cafe Remix is a puzzle game in the style of Disney Tsum Tsum and Yokai Watch Wibble Wobble, which I'm sure will mean something to someone. Under the pretense of owning a restaurant, players must link together matching icons to help cook dishes and serve them to their customers. Some puzzles are a little tougher than others, but this is practically it. As it turns out, trying to get a full console experience out of something intended to be played on a phone isn't as easy as it looks. The Switch version of Cafe Remix was only available in handheld mode, which sort of defeats the point of the Switch, and players could only interact via the touchscreen, which sort of defeats the point of having the Joy-Cons attached. There's no denying how nice everything looks though, and if you don't mind straining your finger to the point of searing pain, then you might enjoy the simple, repetitive gameplay. Also, it's probably best not to think about why Eevee is working in a cafe kitchen. And without a hairnet too. Disgusting. Number 71. Pokémon Quest. Switch. Hey, kids like Minecraft, don't they? And kids like Pokémon too, so if we put the two together, we'll be rich beyond our wildest dreams, said the developers over at Game Freak before somebody made the decision to make this game free to play. Pokémon Quest was available to download on iOS or Android from June 2018, but 1 month earlier it had released on the Switch, making it eligible for this list. Set on the delightfully named Tumble Cube Island, Quest allows players to interact with blocky versions of the original Pokémon from the Kanto region, only this time they're called Pokézell, just to make things extra confusing. Action-wise, the title centers around maintaining a base camp and the Pokézell, you know what, I'm just going to call them Pokémon, that live there, exploring the island and getting rid of all the bad Pokémon and attracting new Pokémon to join your camp before you train them up and instruct them to viciously destroy their own kind. Good, wholesome fun, as always. Whilst the presentation of Quest was certainly a big plus, players found that there wasn't actually much for them to do once they booted it up. The battles are mostly automated, and considering that most of the enemies in the game are quite weak, sometimes it was easier to just let the game play itself whilst you did something else. We can't fault Game Freak for trying something new though, even if that something new was copying a game that hadn't been out since 2009. Number 70. Pokepark 2 Wonders Beyond. Wii. Just look at how aggressively cheery the cover art is for Wii title Pokepark 2 Wonders Beyond. There's even a flippin' rainbow in the logo, doesn't get much more upbeat than that. Hang on, why is the opening cutscene taking place within the dark bowels of hell? This is not what I was promised at all. The main premise of Pokepark 2 is to rescue the enslaved inhabitants of the titular venue by defeating the 4 different attraction bosses and then taking down the big bad Darkrai. Considering that this is a Pokémon game set in a cuddly theme park, developers Creatures Inc. certainly didn't scrimp when it came to plot. Unfortunately, this juxtaposition wasn't for everyone, with some critics labeling the game's frequent tonal shifts as jarring. The decision to forego turn-based combat in favor of real-time battles was a welcome change, but things quickly got dull and samey, a worrying trend in this list so far. It seems like Wonders Beyond just didn't know what it wanted to be. It wanted to be more serious, but it covered itself in rainbows. It wanted to depart from traditional Pokémon gameplay, but didn't fully commit. Whilst there are definitely highlights to be found here, the game as a whole unfortunately comes out as a bit of a confused mess. Now, to be fair, it came out in 2012. Everyone was a confused mess back then. We all thought the world was going to end. Well, some of us did anyway. Number 69. Nice! Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team. DS. The Pokémon Mystery Dungeon series got its start back in 2005 with the Japanese release of Red Rescue Team and Blue Rescue Team. 1 year later, Western audiences got a taste of the fun, and they found it okay. Being able to pilot a team of Pokémon through randomly altering dungeons to avoid enemies, collect items, and solve mysteries made for a great idea on paper, and that's precisely the experience players got when they bought either of these two games. For this first title, the player's transformation from human to Pokémon was brought about when they accidentally touched one of Ninetales' 9 tails. When this happened, the world was plunged into a series of natural disasters, leading to groups of Pokémon banding together to form, you guessed it, rescue teams. Opinions on the two games ranged wildly, with some adoring this new take on the formula and others feeling like it was far too dramatic a step away from the previous, more child-friendly installments. Alongside all that, Rescue Team Blue also had to contend with the fact that it was released on the DS, whereas Red was the final Pokémon game made available on the Game Boy Advance. Beyond a few dual-screen innovations, Blue failed to live up to expectations, leading many players to wonder why they were being sold an old Game Boy game on their shiny new handheld. Not ideal, that, is it? Number 68. Poképark Wii Pikachu's Adventure. Wii. The first Poképark game was also released on Wii, which you can work out by seeing that it has the word Wii in its title. Astute viewers will have also worked out that it's about going on an adventure with Pikachu, as its subtitle is Pikachu's Adventure. Reading/listening truly is a wonderful thing. The high-voltage hamster is summoned to the eponymous park by none other than Mew, who informs the player that the sky prism which protects the area has been shattered into 14 pieces, and wouldn't you know it, it's your job to find them all. Who saw that one coming? Pikachu and their pals must locate the missing shards, and to do this they have to make friends with various Pokémon across the park. The way they do this is by battling them, which is not a friend-making technique I would recommend in the real world. With its cartoony graphics and chipper music, Poképark Wii was a very inviting-looking game, especially for younger fans of the series. Unfortunately, the battles were uninteresting, the piece collecting got mind-numbing after a while, and older players would frequently end up imagining themselves at a real theme park instead. This so-called childish presentation, which came up as a negative in several reviews, might explain why Creatures Inc. decided to open their next Poképark game in Satan's backyard. Might have gone a little too far the other way there, guys. Now little Susie has PTSD. Number 67. Pokémon XD Gale of Darkness. GameCube. Remember in the late 2000s when everyone used to send the XD emoticon and pretend it was a person laughing? Well, now it's back, in Pokémon game form. Some of us never stopped. Pokémon XD Gale of Darkness isn't about a Coronation Street character gone bad, that's one for the older fans out there, but rather a role-playing spin-off that got a GameCube release back in 2005. The darkness part of the title comes from the concept of shadow Pokémon, corrupted creatures that were introduced back in Pokémon Colosseum, which came out a year earlier. They make a return for this title, a sort of spiritual successor to Colosseum, with Shadow Lugia front and center on the box art. Get it away, it's too scary, I don't like it. Whilst the basic premise of fighting, capturing, and purifying these monsters didn't change much between the two games, Gale of Darkness introduced shadow moves into the equation, variations of existing moves with a demonic twist. Moves having different versions is quite commonplace in Pokémon now, which makes this game a bit of a trendsetter. This was pretty much the only divergence from Colosseum though, which left Gale of Darkness feeling like little more than a cheap cash grab. It might have served players well if they'd never played Colosseum before, but most players agreed that it was just a pale imitation of what had come previously. Ah well, at least the cover art was cool. Oh god, get it away, Mum!
Number 66. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team, Game Boy Advance. With most matched pairs of Pokémon games, it can be a bit of a pain in the arceus to determine which one is better. Not for the two Mystery Dungeon games though, because as we discussed earlier, they were released on entirely different systems. Whilst Blue Rescue Team got rolled out on the DS, which was only a year or two old at that point, Red Rescue Team found a home on the previous generation's Game Boy Advance, and in a surprising turn of events, the game for the older hardware actually performed better. Take that, people younger than me. Being older isn't always worse. Ow, I've just put my back out doing a fist pump. Oh. Red just fit the Game Boy much more neatly than its counterpart fit the DS, as that was the platform it was actually designed for. It also helped that the original version of Blue came with a bug that wiped data from all other Game Boy games when it was paired with Red, which didn't do it any favours. Blue may have been the better seller, but Red was by far the better game. Unfortunately, it was still plagued with the same issues of difficulty spikes and poor multiplayer options that Blue was, leaving neither game in a particularly strong position, but though the Mystery Dungeon sub-series is not to everyone's tastes, for those who are fans of the franchise, the games that started it all will always hold a special place in their hearts, and in particular, Red more than Blue. Number 65. Detective Pikachu Returns, Switch. At time of recording, Detective Pikachu Returns for Nintendo Switch is the most recent Pokémon game to have been given a proper release. Now, just watch them announce 5 new titles before this video actually comes out. Sod's law. Acting as a sequel to the original game for the 3DS, this one re-teams the titular sleuth with his human partner, Tim Goodman. Tim's dad, Harry, has gone missing, and it's up to his son and his furry friend to discover Harry's whereabouts in a series of mishaps, each more exciting than the last. Hopefully, I don't know. The first Detective Pikachu game was a revelation, something never before seen in the Pokémon landscape. When it came time to follow this up, however, Creatures Inc. played it way too safe, which left a lot of people feeling let down. Players found the title to be insultingly easy, leaving most of the gameplay segments fairly redundant. The actual mystery part of this mystery game was also highly predictable, with IGN titling a portion of their review, "You'll very likely figure it out way before the characters do." Think about how frustrating this can be when watching a TV show or movie, and now imagine having to actively move the story along yourself by investigating to reach a conclusion that you actually came to hours ago. Sounds pretty unbearable, to be honest. Detective Pikachu Returns isn't a bad game by any stretch, but it is disappointing, which might actually be worse. You know what never disappoints, though? Pikachu in a tiny hat. That's always gold. Number 64, Pokémon Ranger Guardian Signs, DS. Another entry, another new Pokémon sub-series to talk about. It never bloomin' ends, does it? The Pokémon Ranger series is presented in a similar action role-playing style to the main games, but with the notable difference that players capture creatures by drawing circles around them with the DS's stylus, instead of chucking imaginary balls at them. This was clearly designed to make use of the handheld touchscreen technology, as well as increase the number of wrist injuries in the gaming community by 6,000%. In the third and so far final Ranger game, Guardian Signs from 2010, players are out to stop a nefarious new group known as the Pokémon Pinchers, which is a very hard name to take seriously as a group of villains. They'll team up with a Pichu with a ukulele, helpfully known as Ukulele Pichu, to fight the Pinchers and bring balance to the region. Bring balance to the region. Reviewers were very happy with how Guardian Signs looked, with many compliments being dished out towards its sharp graphics and slick presentation. Unfortunately, many found the title to be too derivative of its two predecessors, with the once novel stylus-based action now being perceived as stale and unimaginative. Whilst not terrible by any stretch, the Ranger games were more of an exercise to show off the DS's unique features, rather than interesting games in their own right. Guardian Signs drew the short straw by simply being the last one, with no number of musical electric types able to save it from subpar reviews. Number 63, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX, Switch. Touching down on the Switch in 2020, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX is the first example on this list of a Pokémon series staple, the remake. Many classic Pokémon games have been given a fresh coat of paint over the years, but this one was special, as it was the first remake of a non-core title in the franchise. Rescue Team DX is a remake of the first two Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games, Red Rescue Team and Blue Rescue Team. Considering we've already talked about those and we're only a third of the way through the list, your hopes for this one are probably quite low. But you know what? It actually did alright. The plot is largely unchanged from the original games. The player turns into a Pokémon and fannies about in some caves for a bit, you know the drill. But the Switch version looks considerably better, with a more distinctive art style than what had come 15 years earlier. DX also introduced several innovations that have been made since Red and Blue Rescue Team first released, including an autosave function and the ability to mega evolve Pokémon. Alas, remaking the games also meant that the developers were forced to include their boring dungeon designs and stilted gameplay, which is why this redo is still relatively low in the pecking order. In fact, maybe we should have even punished Rescue Team DX for introducing an entirely new generation to this dross, but we're just suckers for pretty pictures here at Team TripleJump, and look how pretty this one is. Number 62, Pokémon Battle Trozei, 3DS. Trozei is the romanized version of a Japanese word meaning give or take. That doesn't really help in describing this game, I just wanted to prove that I'd done some research here. Then again, I probably pronounced it wrong. The two Pokémon Trozei titles are a pair of puzzle games released in 2005 and 2014, respectively. Battle Trozei, also known by the much more boring name Pokémon Link Battle in Europe, was the second of the two to get released, and unfortunately, the worst one. The basics of the Trozei series are that players have to match up different Pokémon icons to create lines of 4 and clear space from the screen. Battle Trozei adds a new dimension, as the icons have different abilities based on their elemental types. Players then go up against an AI opponent, with each icon's strengths and weaknesses playing into the result. This was the first time a Pokémon puzzler had tried to incorporate gameplay elements from the main series, and you have to admire the team at Genius Sorority for trying to shake things up. Still, a puzzle game is a puzzle game at the end of the day, and if there's one thing I know about puzzle games, it's that they tend to wear out their welcome really quickly. Battle Trozei was, as such, slated for being too repetitive, even if the addition of the strategic elements was welcomed. A lack of online multiplayer sealed its fate as a below-average Pokémon game, but hey, at least we all learned something about the Japanese language in this entry. Silver linings. Number 61. Learn with Pokémon Typing Adventure, DS. Hang on a second, this can't be right. An edutainment game that isn't right at the bottom of the list? Surely there's been some mistake. Who did this? Actually, it was us. I mean, it's our video, isn't it? Maybe I should just keep quiet. Learn with Pokémon Typing Adventure was released for the DS in various territories between 2011 and 2013. It's designed to help children learn how to type and spell, as they take on the role of a typist who captures Pokémon by spelling out their names in as short a time as possible. With 403 different critters to collect, there's no shortage of typing for the kids to do, and no shortage of frustrating Pokémon names for them to get wrong. Seriously, how the hell do you actually spell for alligator? As unthrilling as typing the names of colourful monsties might seem, the game does its bit to dress this up with an engaging premise and a deep roster of characters. It performed very well in Japan, with Famitsu magazine giving it a score of 80%, and even though reviewers in other countries weren't quite so kind, it's still not a game to be sniffed at, apparently. Would this title appeal to anyone over the age of 7 years old? No. Were its graphics rather bare bones? Yes. Was the DS Bluetooth keyboard it was bundled with completely useless for literally any other game except this one? Absolutely. But when it specifically comes to games designed to teach children how to type, we can't think of many better than this one. Number 60. Pokémon Go Mobile. Now look, I know we said no mobile games right at the start of this list, but come on, you didn't think we were going to leave off one of the biggest, most innovative, most controversial Pokémon-themed titles of all time, did you? We did say there'd be one exception to the mobile rule. Developed and published by Niantic, Pokémon Go uses augmented reality to project images of Pokémon onto the real world. Players have to actually go outside and walk around, in order to find their coveted prizes, a feature partly implemented to dispel the myth that all gamers are smelly cave dwellers with a chronic fear of exercise. The game was a phenomenon, being downloaded 500,000 times in its first year and sitting on over 1 billion downloads as of right now. It helped boost the popularity of AR and location-based games and introduced a whole new generation of players to Pokémon. So why is it so low on this list? Well, first off, it's a mobile game, which, as we know, are all the devil. No arguments. Okay, I'm only joking. But secondly, the game has been plagued by technical issues throughout its life, frequently crashing and making people very angry that they aren't able to catch a Charmander inside their local branch of Wilco's. Last but not least, though, this thing is a bloody public menace. From gyms cropping up at war memorials, to concerns about players' information being stored, to people actually dying from being distracted by it, Pokémon Go is as infamous as it is cherished. Either way though, you can't deny that it's made an impact. Oh, hang on, there's an Aerodactyl at Tesco. I'll be back in a second, guys. Number 59. Pokémon Super Mystery Dungeon, 3DS. Of the 8 different Mystery Dungeon games officially on this list, Super Mystery Dungeon from 2015 is the highest ranking one, and it's only at number 59. Yikes. It's also the most recent original game in the sub-series, but it still keeps the main gimmick of the player character waking up to discover that they've been turned into a Pokémon. This may seem like fun in the world of video games, but I feel as though Spike Chunsoft don't appreciate how utterly horrifying this would be in reality. It would be like Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. Metapodosis? Is that any good? No, let's move on. Once again, the player must embrace their new form and traverse several procedurally generated dungeons to save the world from a cataclysmic event. It came with a choice of 18 possible player characters and included all 720 Pokémon available at the time, a huge accomplishment for the series. Reviewers were taken by the title's well-plotted story and the introduction of new held items and game mechanics, but, and say it with me now, they found the gameplay tedious and repetitive. A leopard never changes its spots, and a Pokémon Mystery Dungeon never stops being boring. If you're into your roguelikes and want to experience a Mystery Dungeon game, then this one is clearly your best bet. But if this doesn't appeal to you and you've got better things to be getting on with, then may I suggest taking up a more meaningful hobby like stamp collecting or watching paint dry. Number 58, Pokémon Ranger Shadows of Almia. The second game in the Pokémon Ranger series hit Japanese DSs in 2008, before the rest of the world was allowed to have a go later that year. This time around, the prospective Rangers had to attend a special Ranger Academy to learn the basics of the stylus-based play, before progressing to the rank of Rookie. Oh great, I have to go to school in my video game as well, do I? That's just perfect. The way in which players capture Pokémon is completely different in Shadows of Almia than in the first game. This time, Rangers simply have to fill a friendship bar instead of completing a number of different patterns without lifting the stylus. In fact, they were encouraged to do this to avoid attacks that would otherwise break the loop. There were 17 possible partner Pokémon to choose from, as opposed to the previous games too, and the option to take on additional side quests and missions outside of the main storyline. All sounds rather good then. So what's it doing all the way down here? Well, a lot of criticism was leveled at the game's primary plotline, which was deemed uninteresting and bland, and ultimately, people just couldn't get on board with a Pokémon game where the main objective was to scribble a load of circles. If this is your sort of thing, chances are you'll love the depth and variation of Shadows of Almia, but for those who like their Pokémon games to be more, well, Pokémon games, it's probably not worth it. Number 57, Pokémon Unite, Switch. Developed by Tai Mai Studio Group, the brains behind Call of Duty Mobile, Pokémon Unite, stylized in all caps, is a free-to-play MOBA that found a home on the Switch as well as on mobile platforms. Like most MOBAs, Pokémon Unite drops a number of players into a random arena, sorts them into teams, and then lets them batter the hell out of each other. Only this time, they're playing as some of their favorite Pokémon. I say some of their favorite Pokémon because only 20 playable characters were available upon launch. Though that number has since increased to over 50, that's still not great when you consider there are over 1,000 of the little buggers now. I'm not suggesting there should be 1,000 playable characters in this game, that would be mental, but maybe a few more wouldn't hurt. This relatively shallow roster certainly hasn't affected the player base though, as the game has been downloaded over 80 million times. The actual battling is fun and frenetic, with enough skill needed to level up Pokémon in battle to keep players coming back for more. It even earned a place at the Pokémon World Championships esports tournament in 2022. Yes, it might be stuffed full of predatory microtransactions, but criticizing a MOBA for that is like criticizing the sun for being too hot. It's just in its nature. Unite is far from perfect, but it's certainly found a passionate audience that shows no signs of going away anytime soon. Number 56, Pokémon Ranger, DS. Our third and final examination of Pokémon Ranger takes us way back to where it all began for this stylus swizzling sub-series. A game called Pokémon Ranger. I mean, it was the first one, so what do you expect? This DS title was released at a very exciting time for Pokémon fans, as it came out the same year as Diamond and Pearl. It was also made compatible with the Gold and Silver remakes that came out 3 years later, allowing players to transfer over assets, including the egg of legendary Manaphy. Oh, I suppose you'll just have to buy all 5 games to get the full experience, said Nintendo, dollar signs in their eyes. As for the game itself, Pokémon Ranger set the bar for its 2 sequels, introducing the Stylus, or Styler as it's called in-game, as a method of capture, and giving the player a partner Pokémon to work with. Granted, the Pokémon you got was entirely dependent on your character's gender, but this was 2006, a different, more boring time. The first Ranger title comes out on top for us because it was so innovative for that point in Pokémon gaming history. The stylus interactions weren't the most thrilling thing, but this was the first major attempt to diversify the series in quite a while, and it was interesting to watch it play out in a well-structured series of missions. Unfortunately though, Ranger was a series that was just too different to ever fully succeed. Proof that the phrase, "if it ain't broke, don't fix it," is a very wise mantra. Number 55, Pokémon Violet, Switch. After drilling through the bedrock of spin-offs, sub-series, and educational titles, we have finally hit our first mainline Pokémon installment, at number 55. Oh dear. After a 3-year wait, gamers were introduced to the next generation of Pokémon when Scarlet and Violet hit shelves in 2022. This was the 9th time the series had put out new major titles, and these two promised a lot of cool things, like open-world areas, special paradox Pokémon, and a method of transforming your Pokémon into new forms called terastallizing. All of this would have been great had the bloody things actually worked. In reviews of the game prior to their release, news outlets reported that Scarlet and Violet were riddled with bugs and technical issues. Changing weather effects would cause the frame rate to plunge, resulting in your character appearing to walk through treacle instead of air. Character models would get stuck in walls and floors like they were ghosts, and sometimes the game would just crash or freeze for no discernible reason. Players who were able to successfully overcome this litany of problems found that they liked the non-linear story structure and the emotional plot, but everyone else was utterly fuming that they dropped some serious Pokebucks on something that was outright broken, even with a day 1 patch. Violet fared ever so slightly worse in critical reviews of the two, hence its placement, but the problems with both games were embarrassingly abundant, so let's just move on and not talk about them anymore, yeah? Number 54, Pokémon Scarlet, Switch. Yes, because we're gluttons for punishment here at Team TripleJump, and if you hadn't noticed that we only mentioned Violet in the number 53 entry name, we've decided to rank the mainline games as individual titles. As a result, we have to talk about this utter disaster of a video game not once, but twice in quick succession. Somebody fetch me a very strong coffee. And maybe the office swear jar. I won't spend too long on those same technical issues we talked about in the previous entry, mainly for the sake of everyone's mental health. Instead, let's talk about the subtle yet vital differences between these two titles. For one, the covers are different, with Violet supporting a picture of Miraidon, the legendary electric/dragon type, while Scarlet has one of Koraidon, a mythical dragon and fighting mix. Both can be ridden like motorcycles, because they have wheels, and they also... Hang on, what? They have wheels? Oh, it finally happened, everyone. Pokemon ran out of good ideas. The designs of these two legendaries reflect the overall themes of both games. Koraidon is more ancient-looking, as Scarlet focuses more on the past, whilst Miraidon's futuristic flair relays Violet's emphasis on things yet to come. On the whole, the past Pokemon are better designed and more interesting than those from the future, which might be why Scarlet did ever so slightly better amongst reviewers. This is ultimately meaningless though, as both got the 2 lowest review scores in the history of mainline Pokemon games, so I'd maybe wait for Generation 10 if I were you. Number 53. Pokémon Card GB2 Here Comes Team Great Rocket, Game Boy Color. Taking a trip in the Pokécopter back over to Japan now for another game that never saw a release outside of Nintendo's home nation. Pokémon Card GB2 Great Rocket Dan Sanjo, with Great Rocket sometimes stylized simply as GR, came out on the Game Boy Color in 2001, and is yet another game that allows players to play the Pokémon card game in digital form. Clearly, the TCG is more popular than we first thought. The player character in GB2 must travel around a series of island settings, doing battle with the various members of the villainous Team Great Rocket they come into contact with. After besting all the baddies, they must then take on the final boss, a character called King Biruichi, to be crowned the new top dog. So basically, it's a normal Pokémon game on a much smaller scale and with cards instead of pixelated dragons. As you may have guessed from the number 2 in its name, this game is a sequel to something we'll be getting to a bit later on. As a follow-up, it does a great job of retaining the core elements of the previous game, whilst also adding an extra area and additional cards, including some that were only previously available in vending machines. Famitsu magazine gave it 29 out of 40, which equates to 72.5%, but with a lack of other major reviews out there, Great Team Rocket will have to settle for being judged as mediocre for the time being. Number 52. Detective Pikachu 3DS. What if Pikachu but Sherlock Holmes? This wasn't exactly a burning question in 2018, but clearly someone had asked it, and that's when the first Detective Pikachu game burst onto the scene. This adventure for the 3DS brings together the crime-solving Electro Mouse and a human called Tim Goodman, whose father Harry used to be Pikachu's partner. With Harry missing and his faithful sidekick suffering from amnesia, it's up to young Timmy to rescue his dad, restore Pikachu's memory, and save the world from aliens. Okay, I did add that last part myself, but excuse me for trying to have a little fun. As left field of an idea as it was, Detective Pikachu had a lot of potential to take the Pokémon series into uncharted territory. But whilst it certainly did that, it was not without its teething problems. Although the story was intriguing enough, backed by its strong chemistry between Pikachu and Tim, there was very little skill required to solve the various puzzles that a player would encounter, which detracted from many people's enjoyment. The game's runtime was also criticised, with website howlongtobeat.com claiming the main storyline could be finished in 12 hours. Although, for some people suffering from Red Dead Redemption 2 related trauma, that might actually be classed as a good thing. For all its faults, Detective Pikachu was one of the boldest steps the franchise had taken in quite some time, and also the Pikachu in a funny hat defense from earlier still applies here. Look at him. Number 51. Pokémon Shining Pearl, Switch. Since 2004, several older mainline Pokémon games have been remade for new hardware, a new audience, and to buy executives at Nintendo a new house. Diamond and Pearl got this treatment in 2021, when they became Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl for the Switch. Originally announced as part of Pokémon's 25th anniversary celebrations, these long-named games promised to improve on the originals for the DS and bring the 4th generation of the franchise up to date. Is that what they did? In one word, no. In more than one word, no. First of all, let's talk about dem graphics. The chibi art style can be fun at times, and some people really like it, but it was definitely a bold choice to impose it on players for an entire game, a decision that many felt did not pay off. It's a bit difficult to take the villain's threats of apocalypse seriously when they look like something out of Hello Kitty. The introduction of a subterranean Grand Underground was praised, but elsewhere in the games, things were practically the same as they'd been some 15 years and an entire console generation earlier. If anything, the games had been remade too well and were basically just shinier versions of the ones that already existed. This is the point of a remake to a certain extent, but fans had come to expect more new features and updates from Pokémon redos by this point in time. Number 50. Pokémon Brilliant and Diamond, Switch. As with Scarlet and Violet, we have the unenviable task of deciding which of these two disappointing remakes is the shiniest turd, or brilliantest turd, I suppose. I don't know, turd might be a bit harsh, but I'm sticking by it. When choosing which new Pokémon game to get, a good way to make up your mind is to consult the list of each one's version-exclusive fauna. Some Pokémon are only available in one version of the game, and that's how it's always been, meaning players had to trade with their friends in order to fully complete a Pokédex, or, in Nintendo's wildest dreams, buy both games. The general consensus among fans of the series, Pokéheads as they like to be called, probably, is that Diamond has better exclusives than Pearl. The Aron trio of hulking metal beasts and the dinosaur-inspired Larvitar line are way more popular than the likes of Stantler, Hondor, and Purugly in the court of public opinion, and legendary creature Dialga is usually preferred to Pearl's Palkia. Although personally, I wouldn't like to come up against either one of them in a dark alley. Despite having the better range of catchable fare, Brilliant Diamond still couldn't overcome the fact that the developers had been so unimaginative when remaking these games. Though a lot of work had clearly gone into updating the graphics for the modern age, everything else about the 4th gen remakes felt like no work had gone into them at all, and players were not happy at being told to pay more money for something they'd already bought a decade and a half ago. Number 49, Pokémon Picross, 3DS. As I've only just discovered, Picross is not the term for when Pikachu gets angry at Ash. Instead, it's another name for nonograms, a type of puzzle where players are faced with a grid and have to colour in or leave certain squares blank in order to reveal a picture. Is it more exciting to play than it is to read about? I certainly hope so. Pokémon threw their hat into the Picross ring in 2015, when this title became available on 3DS. But instead of just a version of the existing puzzle with some additional sprites plastered over the top, this game actually went out of its way to put a new spin on the formula. Players acquire Pokémon helpers whenever they clear a certain number of puzzles, and different types have different abilities, like electric types being able to zap the level's timer to slow it down, which makes for a much more strategic experience than just clicking on a number of squares. It also comes with various game modes, including a daily training exercise and mural mode, which has to be completed without any additional help. All of this turned what could have been just another cheap cash grab into something that ended up reviewing quite well. One reviewer even called it the perfect Picross gateway drug, although we should actually joke about that because Picross addiction is well recognized and affects billions of people across the world, so just be a bit more considerate. Number 48, Pokémon Colosseum, GameCube. Whoever that weird person is peering out of the background of this cover art needs to stop what they're doing and stop it now. Seriously, so creepy. Pokémon Colosseum is a 3D role-playing game that borrows some elements from the core series, but with a darker twist. The story's main character, Wes, is a former member of Team Snag'em, a group of wrong-uns who are out to collect all of the world's shadow Pokémon, which are creatures whose hearts have been closed off to joy and happiness. I'm not sure how this happened in-universe, but my guess is that they were all forced to work in retail. Wes and his friend Rui must travel the barren and desolate Aura region to uncover the secrets of the shadow Pokémon, stop the baddies, and be home in time for tea and cakes. This sounds like a refreshing change of pace from the usual Pokémon format, and with its unique mechanics, characters, and presentation, Colosseum should have performed better than it did. As the series was still finding its feet in 3D, some of the graphics are so pointy they could legitimately have your eye out. There also isn't a hub world, which would have made things feel a bit more tied together and given players somewhere to touch down between intense battle scenes. Colosseum may have come up short against expectations, but for a grittier Pokémon game taking its first timid steps into the land of 3 dimensions, it could have come out a lot worse. Number 47, Pokémon Trozei, DS. We've done the exclamation mark joke too many times in this list already, so we'll leave it for this one, yeah? My voice can't take any more shouting. Almost a decade before it finally got a sequel on the 3DS, the original Pokémon Trozei game was made available on the regular old DS, which, as we know, is 3 times worse than the 3DS. That's a joke, please don't hurt me. Similar to the second game, the original title is played by matching identical Pokémon-shaped icons together in groups of 4 and then watching them disappear into the Nether Realm. In the story mode, players step into the shoes of secret agent Lucy Fleetfoot, who's charged with stopping the dastardly Phobos battalion and reclaiming all of the Pokémon they've stolen. Sounds serious. So naturally, the only way to deal with this crisis is to solve a series of relaxing puzzles. As well as this spy-themed caper, Pokémon Trozei owners can also participate in an endless mode, battle their friends, and complete a simplified Pokédex by creating groups of 4 of every Pokémon in the game. For what could have easily just been a Tetris ripoff, it's surprisingly dense, and critics were quick to praise its range of game options, inclusion of a story mode, and addictive mechanics. Though not the best Pokémon puzzle game ever made, Trozei is far from the worst. You'll have fun with it if you choose to give it a go, just try not to stare too long into the eyes of the Pokémon icons. They will take your soul. Number 46, Pokémon Art Academy, 3DS. Do you like drawing? Do you like Pokémon? Do you like drawing Pokémon, but don't want to be a loser by using a pencil and some so-called paper? Well, good news, because developers Headstrong Games have just the thing for you. Pokémon Art Academy for the 3DS was marketed as an educational drawing game designed to teach young children the joys of art through the wonderful world of pocket monsters. Few video game series are as well positioned to do this, as different Pokémon come in all shapes and sizes and are more colourful than your nan's language during an episode of her favourite soap opera. Budding young creatives can hone their skills by progressing through various stages of the game, novice, apprentice, and graduate, beginning with the basics before being taught more advanced lessons about shading, gradients, and other arty things I don't understand in the slightest. Art Academy's extensive selection of lessons and simple progression plan earned it big points amongst players, who found it to be just the right level of challenging for young kids. It's informative, entertaining, and patient with those possessing less natural ability than others, which is exactly what you need from an edutainment game. With the help of this thoughtfully structured educational experience, your little one can work their way up to becoming the next Picasso, yeah? Though it was either that or Vincent van Goghing, so be grateful we went with the first option, alright? Number 45, Pokémon Stadium 2, Nintendo 64. No, it's not the ground where Lapras FC play all of their home matches. That's a football joke, I'm reliably informed. Pokémon Stadium is instead a sub-series of games where 3D versions of the Pokepeeps clobber each other in giant arenas. The main difference between these games and their mainline cousins is the lack of a plot, meaning they're solely about big beasties bashing the hell out of each other. Hell yeah! A year on from the first internationally available Stadium game came its sequel, the imaginatively titled Pokémon Stadium 2. It retained the same premise of its older sibling. Players assemble their team of battlers and enter a number of different tournaments. Each cup has their own set of rules, so wannabe winners must pick their squads carefully if they want to become the true Stadium King or Queen. There's also a selection of mini-games, including a Mr. Mime version of tennis, a Hitmontop version of Beyblade, and a Chansey version of that one where you have to collect falling objects. I can't remember its name, no one can. At this point in time, the second generation of core games had come out, meaning there were over 100 additional fighters to choose from over the original Stadium. This, along with the enjoyable battle modes and fun distractions, earned it decent scores amongst casual players and Pokémon nuts alike. But did it do better than the original? Well, obviously not, because we've not talked about that game in this list yet. Try and keep up. Number 44, Pokémon Emerald, Game Boy Advance. For its first 4 generations, Pokémon would release a matched pair of core games, and then, later on, put out a new enhanced version to complete the generational trio. For Gen 3, this was Pokémon Emerald. Set in the Hoenn region, Emerald is your standard Pokémon experience. Choose a starter, collect gym badges, relentlessly trap and slaughter innocent wildlife as you go. You know the drill by now. But the kicker here is that the 2 teams of baddies, Team Magma from Ruby and Team Aqua from Sapphire, are both out to get you at the same time. God, this is way more responsibility than any 10-year-old should ever be asked to handle. This leads to the legendary Pokémon Groudon and Kyogre getting into an almighty scrap, which the player can quell by tracking down the 3rd Hoenn boss, Rayquaza, whose picture adorns the front of Emerald's box. In the post-game, players can also access the Battle Frontier, an entirely new area not available to Ruby and Sapphire owners. Unfortunately, these differences were not enough to get it better review scores than either of its counterparts. Many felt that Emerald wasn't distinct enough to warrant spending extra money on, a common trend in assessments of 3rd editions. There will be some of you out there that are mad that Emerald has ranked so low, particularly because of the Battle Frontier, which massively extended the runtime of the game, but the numbers don't lie, I'm afraid, so Mr. Raymond Quasar will just have to accept his fate on this one. Number 43, Pokken Tournament, Wii U. No, there's not a typo in my script. This game is actually called Pokken Tournament. We don't make that kind of silly mistake here at Team TripleJump. The word Pokken comes from a combination of Pokémon and Tekken, the iconic Bandai Namco fighting series. Though not a crossover in the traditional sense, Pokken Tournament borrows heavily from that Fisticuffs franchise, placing its own famous characters in a traditional fighting game arena and letting them absolutely brain each other for our entertainment. The whole game got its start in Japanese arcades before receiving a worldwide release for the Wii U in 2016. Though that meant it was now available for home gamers and people who didn't live in Japan, this port did only come with 16 available fighters, 4 fewer than its original version. Not a great start then, but not many people seem to mind, as this game is fun as hell. Getting the chance to compete in Pokémon battles in real time was a dream come true for some players, and whilst the roster wasn't as deep as in arcades, the inclusion of Charizard, Lucario, Gengar, Mewtwo, and that darn Pikachu was enough to satisfy. The fights themselves looked great and played smoothly, so there really isn't that much to complain about here, other than the aforementioned roster issue. Obviously, people did find things to complain about: poor amiibo support, a stark contrast between single and multiplayer modes, the fact it doesn't do your housework for you, but those are all really by the by when you are hands-on with this surprisingly good game. Number 42, Pokémon Snap, Nintendo 64. Clearly, someone at Nintendo finally had a moment of moral clarity and realized that encouraging players to trap animals in tiny balls and then force them into gladiatorial combat was wrong. So, they suggested a game where players simply take pictures of Pokémon instead, which is how we got to 1999's Pokémon Snap. With good old Professor Oak to guide them, players take control of a gormless-looking protagonist who is tasked with papping every species of Pokémon on an island called Pokémon Island? Really? That's the best they could do? Christ. There are several unique zones to explore, with plenty of replayability thanks to the various items players collect in future levels. Capturing Pokémon might be inhumane, but throwing pestaballs and apples at them, that's just fine. Most reviews of Pokémon Snap all said the same thing. It shouldn't work, but it does. This was a completely new spin on a franchise built around quite a specific formula of capture and combat, but the quirky gameplay, cute scenarios, and variety of different photo ops quickly turned it into a cult classic. Pokémon Snap is the video game equivalent of a nice country walk on a sunny day. It's almost entirely inconsequential and won't challenge you intellectually, but it's such a wholesome way to spend a couple of hours, and a great escape from reality if your significant other is shouting at you for not doing the dishes. I told you I'll get to it when I've got a good enough picture of Pidgey. Number 41. Pokémon Stadium, Nintendo 64. When Prince sang, "Tonight we're gonna party like it's 1999, he clearly meant he and his friends were gonna sit down and play the new N64 game, Pokémon Stadium. The game that kicked this sub-series off, unless you count that Japanese exclusive one we mentioned earlier, was originally developed for the console add-on, the 64DD. Alas, that turned out to be a giant disaster, so the game was tweaked to fit the standard N64, and everyone was very glad that it was. As we mentioned in the Stadium 2 entry, the objective of this game is to win as many 3D turn-based battles as possible against a selection of opponents under various different rules. The original Stadium, like its sequel, also has no storyline, with players simply progressing through several different cups, and then once those are completed, getting the opportunity to battle the Kanto gym leaders, Elite Four, and the region's Grand Champion. Stadium 1 also comes with minigames, though not as many as its sequel, including a Clefairy version of Simon. Yes, because when I think about video games, I also think about games I would have played as a child at my friend's disappointing birthday party. Though the second game had more to it, this outing was the first to break the mold, which might be why it reviewed better. Also, Prince probably put in a good word for it, and that man has more sway over the games industry than you might have realised. It's a big conspiracy, but I can't tell you right now. It's Ben's turn.
Number 40. Pokken Tournament DX, Switch. It's that Wii U fighting game from earlier, only this time it's sponsored by a British delivery and logistics company. What's that? It's not. Well, what else could it possibly be? Okay, I'm being told that Pokken Tournament DX is actually the Nintendo Switch port of the aforementioned fighting title, although I'm not sure I entirely believe that, as the word Switch contains neither of the letters D or X. This smells like an anti-haulage conspiracy to me, and I will get to the bottom of it. In the meantime, let's talk about the game, which has the same basic premise as its previous generation ancestor. This time, though, there are 23 different Pokémon to play as, including all of the available fighters in the Wii U and arcade versions, plus a few new exclusives. Critics were very happy with this bolstered roster and the ability to competently fight with two players, just not in split screen, which dropped the frame rate down to a microscopic level. Improvements were also made to online play, and a special 3-on-3 mode was introduced, so you can enjoy being beaten by 3 different versions of Pikachu instead of just one. Pokken Tournament DX did exactly what it was supposed to do, take a pre-existing game on an old console and bring it up to speed with a new one, adding new features and characters and tinkering with things that didn't quite work. A rousing success then, even with a distinct lack of delivery truck driving gameplay. Number 39. New Pokémon Snap, Switch. Whilst Pokken Tournament DX waited just 1 year to update an older game, new Pokémon Snap revived a title that had been dormant for over 2 decades. As you can probably work out, new Pokémon Snap is an updated version of the original Pokémon Snap that we discussed earlier, hitting Switch consoles worldwide in 2021. With Bandai Namco replacing original developer HAL Laboratory, this game maintains the original on-rails photo-taking premise of its predecessor, whilst dragging everything else kicking and screaming into the modern world. Whilst there were just 63 possible targets in the first game, new Pokémon Snap is home to over 230 different species to capture through the medium of photography. More new features include the option to work either during the day or at night, which changes the type of Pokémon available, and the introduction of Illumia Pokémon, which are essentially just versions that glow in the dark. There was a very real risk that updating something as twee and cute as Snap would rob it of its charm, but new Snap is just as magical, with far more to do and many more ways in which to do it. First-time snappers were happy with it, as were players who grew up with the original, which we think is a sign of a job well done. Now, where's that giant glowing fish Pokemon I was trying to take a picture of earlier? Oh god, here it comes! Number 38. Pokémon Crystal, Game Boy Color. It's another enhanced edition of a mainline Pokémon game, this time as part of the second generation, aka the ones you got bullied for liking at school because it meant you jumped on the bandwagon later than everyone else. Crystal came out for the Game Boy Color between 2000 and 2001, roughly a year after the release of Gold and Silver. Its cover featured Suicune, not to be confused with Sweet Corn, and it promised players a more comprehensive look at the Johto region. As with all of the enhanced games, the best way to talk about them is to compare what they added to the core gameplay experience. Crystal introduced a huge change right from the very start, allowing players to choose their character's gender for the first time. Crystal was also home to the first Battle Tower, a facility where players could climb floors by defeating different trainers one at a time. This concept would appear in numerous future installments, marking yet another tick in Crystal's column. Unfortunately, this is about where the differences end. The game was called out at launch for being relatively similar to Gold and Silver, which might explain why it only sold 6.3 million copies, the smallest number ever for a major Pokémon release, but still, quite a lot. In spite of all of this, Crystal still has a passionate following to this day, which surely counts for something. Number 37. Pokémon Black 2, DS. With the release of Black and White 2 in 2012, Pokémon did something they'd never done before: put out a direct sequel to one of their core series. But new Pokémon games are supposed to have fun new names, the hardcore fanbase cried, weeping into their life-size Jigglypuff body pillow, but they soon got over their issues once they actually played the game. Set 2 years after the events of the first game, Black 2 takes place in the Unova region, where the devious Neo Team Plasma are out for revenge after being thwarted in the previous chapter. As well as saving the world from their plans to steal huge numbers of Pokémon, there's also the much more important task of beating gym leaders and stealing their shiny buttons. Critical response to this brave new endeavor was strong, as they were happy with the introduction of new Pokémon, locations, and game mechanics such as the key system and hidden grottos. There was just one problem: to fully understand the story, you had to have played the first game. Whilst this is never normally an issue in video games, imagine complaining about not understanding The Last of Us Part 2 without having played the first one. This was Pokémon, a series famous for its pick-up and playability, if that is indeed even a word. Perhaps this is why Nintendo have refrained from greenlighting another set of direct Pokémon sequels, though in fairness, these ones were really good. Number 36. Pokémon White 2, DS. As we've already mentioned, separating out the two games in a matched pair of Pokémon titles is a bit of a challenge, but with Black 2 and White 2, it was damn near impossible. Both games have exactly the same review score almost everywhere you look, and there aren't even individual sales figures to go by, so for this decision we had to turn to a very dark place: the opinions of people online. May God have mercy on our souls! With every new set of Pokémon titles, there is always a raging fan debate over which one is better, which one should be bought, and whose mother is a lying, cheating piece of don't want to get demonetized. Through hours of painstaking research, maybe, I don't know, I didn't do it, we have concluded that White version 2 is the superior of the pair. Firstly, the exclusive Pokémon in White 2 are deemed better by the internet community, as was the White version of cover Pokémon Kyurem, a black version of which is available in Black 2. Secondly, there's what happens after the main game is over. Upon beating the Pokémon League, White 2 players will be allowed to switch into Easy Mode, which makes things, easier. As for Black 2 players, they get the option of Challenge Mode, which makes battles harder. Whilst some people might relish the greater challenge, we're quite lazy here at TripleJump, so Easy Mode gets our vote. Number 35. Pokémon Trading Card Game, Game Boy Color. The very best video game about the Pokémon Trading Card Game is just called Pokémon Trading Card Game. Was that worth the wait? Probably not. First released in Japan in 1998 and North America, Europe and Australia in 2000, Pokémon Trading Card Game is a card-playing simulator for the Game Boy Color. The game features all the cards from the first 3 series of the real-life game, as well as several exclusive cards not available in reality. Players choose a starting deck in a similar fashion to choosing a starter Pokémon and must then travel around the map, making friends along the way before beating them in a match and stealing all their money. At least that's how I played it in my head. This was a big hit over in Japan, where it became the 20th best-selling console game of 1999. Outside of the islands, American audiences dug it too, with reviewers claiming that it had all the fun of the real game without taking up nearly as much space. Clearly, some people had children with a card-buying habit. Though it didn't stand a chance against the top end of the core series, Pokémon Trading Card Game does offer the best experience in its chosen field. Now, let's never talk about trading cards ever again. Thank you. Number 34. Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu, Switch. 20 years after its initial release, Pokémon Yellow got a set of 2 remakes, Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee. Much like Yellow, these games were set in the Kanto region during the first generation of Pokémon and had the added twist of allowing one special Pokeboy or girl to walk next to you. Ooh. So a Pokemon's choices are either being stuck in a tiny ball or walking thousands of miles alongside some annoying kid. Great. The main difference between the 2 versions of Let's Go is the Pokémon that players start with. In Let's Go Pikachu, it's Pikachu, whilst in Let's Go Eevee, it's a Wobbuffet. Oh, no, sorry, I meant an Eevee. Silly me! The differences to the original games are numerous and not just because of 2 decades worth of technological advancements. Instead of hiding in the long grass, wild Pokémon are now visible, a delightful visual. When a player wants to catch one, they can simply throw Pokeballs and berries at it like they would in Pokémon Go, only without the danger of being hit by a bus. This is fine, but some people liked the wild Pokémon battles and were sad to see them go. Despite not being an original idea, the Let's Go series are beautiful recreations of where it all began for Pokémon and have helped countless younger players discover Kanto for the first time. For our money, Pikachu is the less preferable option, and you'll have to stick around to find out why. Ooh, exciting! Number 33. Pokémon Shield. Switch. Cor blimey, governor, it's them Pokemon games set in Britain, so it is cor blimey tuppence a bag, bottle of water. Sorry, I don't know what came over me there. How unbecoming. For the 8th generation of adorable creature fights, Pokémon decided to set itself in the Galar region based on good old England for Sword and Shield. With the blade-carrying Zacian on one box and the defensively minded Zamazenta on the other, these games promise players a jolly spiffing time. Both games are packed with new features, ranging from camp mode, where players could interact with their Pokémon, to the introduction of Dynamax and Gigantamax forms, which transformed selected warriors into humongous versions of themselves. Now that's what I call a big boy. Out of all of the matched pairs on this list, Sword and Shield are amongst the easiest to tell apart as they have several distinct differences. One example is the gym leaders, which are different in the 2 games. Sword is home to the fighting trainer Bee and rock trainer Gordy, whilst Shield has Alistair and Melanie, who specialise in ghost and ice types respectively. The game is also home to Max Raids, where a group of trainers can team up to take on one giant Mon. These are different in the 2 versions as well, and between these, the gym leaders and the exclusive Pokémon, it's generally agreed that the sword is mightier than the shield in this case. If only it had been called Pokémon Gun instead. Number 32. Pokémon Sword. Switch. Pokémon Sword might have been better than Pokémon Shield, but not by much, and neither title was without its controversies. The most talked about fault with the 2 games was the much derided decision to severely restrict the number of older Pokémon available in these titles. This was done to save on time and costs, and also because there were approximately 1 million Pokémon by this point, but when has the internet ever cared about sensible stuff like that? Instead, hardcore fans sharpened their pitchforks and reached for their burning torches. They dubbed this incident Dexit, a combination of Pokédex and Brexit, and considering that these games were set in a version of the UK, the devs really should have seen that one coming. This limited Pokédex, plus complaints about a poor story and lack of exploration options, dampened Sword and Shield somewhat, but most players agreed that they were still damned fine inclusions into the canon. The public certainly didn't mind, as they bought enough copies to make this the 2nd best-selling generation in Pokémon history. Though they may not have hit a home run, or should that be a 6 if we're using English terms, Sword and Shield still brought plenty new to the Poké table, and for the first completely original mainline Pokémon games available on home console, they did a decent job bringing the experience into people's living rooms. Also, we haven't even discussed some of the regional forms available in Galar. Look at Weezing, it's got a hat! And you all know how we feel about Pokémon in jaunty hats, come on. Number 31. Pokémon Let's Go Eevee. Switch. A few entries on from its twin, we find Pokémon Let's Go Eevee, which was also a remake of the much applauded Pokémon Yellow from back in the day. As well as the changes outlined in the Pikachu entry, these games also added Mega Evolutions and regional forms into the mix, things that players could have only dreamt of back in 1998. Like any main Pokémon game, there are version-exclusive wild beasties in these 2 titles. Which lineup you prefer will come down to personal preference, but it might actually be Eevee that takes it in this category. Where the real differences lie is in the titular Pokémon themselves, as Eevee is way more advanced than a certain electric mouse. Both creatures have special moves they can learn in the game. Pikachu has 3, one of which is called Splishy Splash, because why not? Whilst the little brown furball has 8, one for all of the types it can evolve into. Also, whilst wild Pikachus are as common in Let's Go Eevee as seagulls are near fish and chip shops in a seaside town, there is just a single Eevee in the other game, which players have to sneak into a mansion to steal. Sounds like hard work, and also, it's illegal. Pikachu has had his chance to star as a mascot, so it's nice to see somebody else come along, take the spotlight, and run with it. Unless, of course, you're a devoted Pika head, then there's no real choice here. Number 30. Pokémon Conquest. DS. Nobunaga's Ambition is a franchise of turn-based grand strategy games that helped popularize the genre when it was first emerging back in the early 80s. Why am I telling you this? Because in 2012, Nobunaga's Ambition crossed over with a very unlikely partner. Bet you'll never guess who! Pokémon Conquest for the DS took the characters and language of Pocket Monsters and transported it over to the land of tactical role-playing. Players take on the position of the warlord leader of one of several kingdoms who must unite the warring factions and fulfill an ancient legend before its power falls into the wrong hands. So yeah, it's a tiny bit different from catching weird-looking dogs and then making them bite each other. In Conquest, players have a team of Pokémon that each have different abilities on the battlefield. They can only use one move, but when played in conjunction with other creatures, this opens up a world of possibilities for strategy-based fun. A crossover as bizarre as this could easily have flopped, but critics were very taken by the way in which these two unlikely bedfellows meshed together. They liked the historical Japanese setting and the compelling story, among other things, and whilst some criticized the strategy elements for being too basic, others labeled it the greatest Pokémon spin-off ever made. If Nobunaga's actual ambition was to make a great game enjoyed by all, then he succeeded. Good job, Nobunaga. Help yourself to a biscuit. Number 29. Pokémon Leaf Green. Game Boy Advance. 8 years after the first Pokémon games took the world by storm and ruined adults' bank accounts everywhere, some bright spark at Nintendo had the idea to bring those old games up to speed and rake in the cash all over again. The results of this brainwave were Pokémon Fire Red, a remake of Pokémon Red, and Pokémon Leaf Green, a remake of Pokémon Blue? Clearly whoever was in charge of naming this one was suffering from color blindness, and before you get angry, I know that green was the other color in the original Japanese release. You can stop typing comments now. As well as updated graphics and audio, the developers of Fire Red and Leaf Green also added some new features to make these remakes worth buying. As they'd come along during the third generation of Pokémon, new creatures were able to be caught, boosting the number of available Poképals beyond the original 151. Dark and Steel types didn't exist when Red and Blue came out, so they were chucked in, and mercifully Charizard was updated so that it could learn flying type moves. You know, because why would a Pokémon who had wings be able to learn fly right from the start? Make it make sense, Nintendo! Whilst they were never going to capture the magic of the originals, the Gen 1 remakes sold well, reviewed well, and most importantly of all, drove millions more parents to their local game shops to satisfy the pokey lust of their precious little ones. Another win for capitalism. Number 28. Pokémon Fire Red. Game Boy Advance. Just like it would in real life, Fire beats Leaf in this particular battle. Actually, that was never going to be a fair fight. Whose idea was this? Unlike the massacre it would be in the real world, this fight is actually way closer. Like with the original games, the differences between Fire Red and Leaf Green are almost negligible, with the major contrasts being the different Pokémon available in each one. Leaf Green has the Bellsprout line, whilst Fire Red has Oddish and its evolutions. The Red game is home to the likes of Scyther, Psyduck, and Growlithe, whilst its green friends star folks like Slowking, Staryu, and Vulpix. Your mileage will vary depending on which ones are your favourites, but for my money, any game without Psyduck in it isn't worth playing. And I mean that about video games in general, not just Pokémon. Just try and tell me that Breath of the Wild wouldn't have been improved by playing as a confused water bird. Go on, I'll wait. In the end, Fire Red just about takes it over Leaf Green, but both of these games are loving remakes of their original source material that didn't offer loads in the way of innovation, but did wonders in bringing lapsed fans back into the fold and introducing younger gamers to the genesis of the glorious franchise. Also, if you're still looking for further explanations as to why Fire Red won, it has a Charizard on the front cover. Need I say more? Number 27. Pokémon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire. Game Boy Advance. Though we never include physical pinball tables in these rankings, there is certainly room for pinball-themed games on consoles or handhelds. With that in mind, please welcome to the stage Pokémon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire, a 2003 release for the Game Boy Advance. Released in North America on the 5th anniversary of Red and Blue coming to the country, Pinball Ruby and Sapphire is, and this may shock you, a pinball game inspired by the events of Pokémon Ruby and Pokémon Sapphire. What will they think of next? As well as firing a tiny metallic ball up the screen with a spring and then flapping at it with paddles like your life depends on it, this title also incorporates some of the capture mechanics that define the series it's based on. In Catch-em-all mode, pinballers score points until a silhouetted Pokémon is revealed, which they then have to smack a number of times in order to bag. In Egg mode, it's a similar story, only this time the newly hatched Pokémon can wander about. Evolution mode allows players to grow their existing menagerie by scoring points, and Travel mode whisks them away to exotic locations. Ooh, not bad then, even if the core gameplay does just come down to whacking a little metal sphere around. This fun combination, alongside the fact that it was quite different from its predecessor, made Ruby and Sapphire the belle of the ball, the pinball, if you will. Sorry, not sorry. Number 26. Pokémon Alpha Sapphire, 3DS. It's remake time again. 12 years after their stupid old regular versions came out, Pokémon Alpha Sapphire and Omega Ruby graced the 3DS in 2014. Players who enjoyed the Hoenn region back in the day could now explore their favourite haunts in glorious new graphical detail and in 3D that hopefully would not make them feel sick. Much like the original, you start the game riding in the back of a moving truck because your parents don't love you enough to sit you in a proper seat. Once you've arrived in your new home, it's time to choose a starter and set out on your own with full knowledge that your abusive parents won't miss you one bit. As so much time had passed between these versions and the originals, there was plenty for the developers to add in. Mega evolutions are not only present but play a part in the plot. You can also track wild Pokémon and add a cosplaying Pikachu to your collection. Oh, it thinks it's a wrestler. The 3D visuals were actually praised by several review outlets, so they clearly didn't have them reaching for a bucket, and the new additions were also a welcome touch. Weirdly, it seems as if this game relies heavily on travelling to places on water, which means you'll practically always have to have a Pokémon that knows surf in your party. This is a minor gripe, but one that was picked up on by those in the know. Number 25. Pokémon Omega Ruby, 3DS. In complete disregard for the ancient Greek language, we have Omega before Alpha on this list. Are we sorry? Absolutely not. Those Greeks deserved it, especially you, Pythagoras. That'll teach you for making me learn about boring triangles at school. Like their ancestors, you can tell Alpha Sapphire and Omega Ruby apart by the different teams of villains you encounter in the story. Alpha pits players against Team Aqua, a group dedicated to flooding the land and bringing back a primal version of the legendary Kyogre, whilst Omega is home to Team Magma, who want to dry up the world's oceans in order to make room for the primal Groudon. Can I just say, neither of those plans sound particularly sustainable, guys. Despite having opposing worldviews, the teams go about their work in very similar ways, so the gameplay isn't affected much in that regard. Once again, it's down to those exclusive Pokémon again, and we think the red gemstone has the edge in this one. No matter which dual players opt for, they'll have a glorious time with these games, regardless of whether or not they visited Hoenn before. Plus, they get a great view of the region from the back of a Latios or Latias, which come equipped with a new move called Soar, allowing them to fly literally anywhere on the map. Also, when soaring, you'll encounter mirage spots, which are home to Pokémon you won't find anywhere else in the game, including other generations' legendaries. Spicy. Number 24. Pokémon Puzzle League, Nintendo 64. Picture this. Ash and Pikachu are on vacation when Professor Oak gives them a call, presumably to tell Ash that he's now dating his mother and wishes to be referred to as Oak Daddy from now on. Thankfully, rather than that nightmare scenario, the professor is actually ringing to tell his young charge about a new upcoming tournament, one where the greatest Pokémon trainers in the land will gather to prove who is the best at solving puzzles? Seems a bit out of place, but okay, I'll go with it. This is Pokémon Puzzle League, which came out for the N64 in 2000 or 2001 for our European pals. Ha! Pal! You like the region? No? Okay. Taking its cue from the Japanese series Panel de Pon, players must guide falling blocks in order to create rows of 3, which will make them disappear, thus creating more space. The objective is to keep going until one player runs out of room. In the single-player campaign, Ash progresses through the tournament, encountering more and more difficult opponents as he goes, including Misty, Brock, the Team Rocket Gang, and Tracy? Who's Tracy? Oh, he was in the Orange Islands saga, I remember now. Sorry, Tracy. As well as all this, there's also a multiplayer mode, an endless mode, and lots of other goodies for the doting puzzle fan. Critics agreed that Puzzle League presented a range of challenges for older and younger players alike, making it a surprisingly fun detour from the regular Pokémon track. Number 23. Pokémon Pinball, Game Boy Color, The first of 2 Pokémon-themed pinballs released on handhelds came out 4 years and a whole system earlier than the one titled Ruby and Sapphire. It was not called Pokémon Pinball Red and Blue, presumably because they didn't want the words ball and blue that close together in a title. The basic gameplay we talked about earlier hadn't changed much from the original, which was also about playing pinball, scoring high scores, and then using them to fill up a Pokédex, evolve creatures, and prove that you're the best. There are 2 different tables, which actually are called Red and Blue, and playing a selected table in a selected location will alter the different types of Pokémon available to catch. The game also came equipped with a rumble feature, reviews of which range from good to a waste of a good battery. Despite there seemingly being more to do in Pinball Ruby and Sapphire, the review scores for the original Pokémon Pinball are higher. We've seen this a lot in this list. A sequel to a spin-off will offer more features, yet it will perform worse than the game it was meant to be improving on. Is this because these games tried to do too much? Is it because they didn't innovate enough and were in line for unfavorable comparisons to the previous models? Whatever the reason, I can guarantee that nobody has ever given this much thought to a game where the objective was to flick a virtual ball bearing directly into Meowth's face. You're welcome. Number 22. Pokémon Platinum DS. After Pokémon Diamond and Pearl came out, the company switched tact and decided to go for the sequels option seen in Black and White 2. That makes Pokémon Platinum, which got a standalone release after Diamond and Pearl, the final 3rd edition of a Pokémon game at the time of writing. Following on from the events in the Sinnoh region, Platinum pivots focus away from the legendaries Dialga and Palkia and onto Giratina, a Pokémon that was present in the other 2 games but not like this. Now, Giratina is the target of the evil Team Galactic, who wish to use its dimension-warping powers to create a new world. This is how players discover its 2 different forms, the Altered form, which stands at 4.5 meters tall, and the Origin form, which is 6.9 meters tall. Nice. As well as this new story, which also introduces new characters, Platinum is perhaps best known for introducing the Distortion World, a place where normal rules of physics do not apply and everything seems a bit blurry. I would call that being hungover at Sunday dinner around my parents' house world. Whilst Platinum certainly offered way more than previous 3rd installments, it also suffered from the same curse of being way too similar to what had come before it. Whilst there were a few more recommendations to buy this one outright, the major consensus was if you didn't care much for Diamond and Pearl, then Platinum would do nothing for you. Peter?
Number 21. Pokémon Legends Arceus Switch. Imagine this, you've just woken up in a strange land, having been flung backwards in time by forces beyond your comprehension. Do you A. try to work out how to get back home to your family and friends, or B. immediately accept there's nothing you can do and follow the orders of a man in a funny hat? If you chose B, then you might just be the protagonist from Pokémon Legends Arceus. Thanks for joining us, hello. Set in the Sinnoh region, long before it was even known as that, Legends Arceus sees the aforementioned time traveler attempting to complete a rudimentary Pokédex whilst also trying to discover the mystery of a giant hole in the sky. Large portions of the game are open world, allowing players to roam freely, interact with NPCs, and catch as many Pokémon as their heart desires, either by sneaking up on them or using good old-fashioned brute force. This marked the biggest change to the core Pokémon mechanics in a long time, and players were very taken by this novel approach. With new powerful alpha Pokémon to encounter, strong and agile style moves to master, and several stunning landscapes to explore, this Legends game goes a long way to living up to its name. That's not to say it's perfect, far from it. The boss battles get insanely repetitive, having to craft certain items is a pain, and some of the characters are beyond irritating. Not the funny hat man though, he's great. Love this guy. Number 20. Pokémon Ultra Moon 3DS. Whilst Pokémon Platinum was the most recent 3rd edition of a Pokémon game, there have been 2 enhanced editions put out since its release. These are Pokémon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, which came out in 2017 as the director's cut versions of the previous year's Sun and Moon. For players who enjoyed their time in the Alola region, there's a lot more to get stuck into, as well as new Pokémon, including one called Stakataka, which is a ridiculous name, and Nanganadel, which honestly makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. There's also a photo-taking mode, a new way to surf, and the option to travel through wormholes to meet new Pokémon. Hopefully not Nanganadel though. Stop pointing that thing at me! In terms of the story, the baddie this time around is a Pokémon called Necrozma, who, judging by the look of it, should have been the villain all along. Trainers must stop this evil mass of triangles from draining the world of its light, which I'm told would be very bad. Once again, it's down to those exclusives to determine the better game here, and these two wear their differences proudly on their cover art. Ultra Moon's box features a unique form of Necrozma called Dawn Wings, whilst Ultra Sun's is emblazoned with a form called Dusk Mane. In the end, most players agree that Duskmane takes the cake, which is emblematic of the exclusives being better on the sunny side. Number 19, Pokémon Ultra Sun. As we mentioned literally 5 seconds ago, Ultra Sun is clearly the better option out of these two. If you'd somehow forgotten that, then may I suggest seeking urgent medical attention. With its front cover proudly displaying Duskmane Necrozma, which sounds like some sort of rash, Ultra Sun offers players another crack at the 7th main Pokémon title, and it did well amongst the diehards. Both games were praised for the improvements they made to their protoforms in terms of graphics and audio, as well as for bringing new features to the gameplay, shifting up the story, and adding in tons more to do once the main credits had rolled. Sun and Moon have a strong cult following amongst Pokémon fans, and some saw these enhanced versions as steps forward for already near-perfect games. Emphasis on some seeing this, not everyone. A few reviewers were critical of the fact that most of the changes to the narrative only took place towards the end of the story, meaning that for the most part, Sun and Moon players will be reliving things they've already seen. As with all the enhanced versions we've seen so far, some also complained that the changes didn't go far enough, and Nintendo were basically just selling the same game twice. Of all the enhanced editions though, Pokémon Ultra Sun is the one that ranked the highest, which makes it a little star in our eyes. Little astronomy joke for you there, you're welcome. Number 18, Pokémon Sapphire, Game Boy Advance. In the early 2000s, the Pokémon series had already established itself as a new titan with its first 2 pairs of main games, but could they bag the hat trick? Short answer, yes. Long answer, yes, with 6 S's on the end. Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire were released in 2002 in Japan and 2003 everywhere else, as the first of a final generation of Pokémon titles for the Game Boy family, the handhelds that had given the franchise its start. Now let me just check, how did they do? Ruby and Sapphire were the best-selling games in the history of the Game Boy Advance, so not too badly then, eh? Set in the Hoenn region, players must choose from Trico, Torchic, and Mudkip in order to save the local professor from being attacked. Hope you made the right call in that split second, because now you're stuck with that creature for life. After rescuing the incompetent academic, it's time to embark on your journey, defeating gym leaders, one of whom is your dad, and overcoming the local team of raging nutters. In Sapphire, that's Team Aqua, who want to flood the Earth and create a home for the legendary Pokémon Kyogre. But don't worry, Aqua, the human race is taking care of that task for you. Not long now, I'm sure. Those ice caps can't last forever. Better exclusives like Solrock, Mawile, and the C-Dot family give Ruby the edge, but both of these games did a fantastic job in wrapping up Pokémon's time on the Game Boy systems. Number 17, Pokémon Ruby, Game Boy Advance. The second part of Pokémon's difficult third album, which isn't the best metaphor actually because the games did very well, is Ruby, where the main difference from Sapphire is that this one is red and that one is blue. No, I'm only joking. In Ruby, the main antagonists are Team Magma, who basically want the exact opposite of Team Aqua, to increase the Earth's landmass to make room for the legendary Groudon. No more flooding, everywhere within driving distance, no salty water getting in your mouth at the beach. Why do we want to stop them, exactly? Ruby and Sapphire introduced elements to the Pokémon series that would become standard in future games. These were the first titles to feature double battles, where a trainer sent out 2 fighters instead of 1, and players also got to know different Pokémon's abilities, a special power shared by an entire species, and natures, personality traits unique to individual creatures. Aw, cute. My tiny collection of coloured pixels has a short temper. How nice of them to tell me. Yes, they may have sold fewer copies than the first 2 games, but they still managed to shift over 16 million units worldwide, which is quite hard to be angry about. So many game series fall at the 3rd hurdle, but Ruby and Sapphire ensured that this franchise kept on running, and in many ways, this led to the pop culture dominance Pokémon is still experiencing to this very day. Number 16. Pokémon Puzzle Challenge, Game Boy Color. Here it is, everyone, the best non-RPG Pokémon game of all time, and it's a puzzle collection for the Game Boy Color. Yeah, I'm just as surprised as you are. Following the release of Pokémon Puzzle League earlier that year, its handheld equivalent, Pokémon Puzzle Challenge, released in late 2000 in Japan and North America, with Europeans getting it the following year. Similar to League, Challenge is played by positioning coloured blocks so they match up and disappear. It comes with a variety of modes, including Endless Play, AI Versus, and Beat the Clock, with players beginning the game able to use the powers of the Johto starters, unlocking more helpers along the way. It really doesn't sound like much, but people went absolutely bananas for it. Critics labelled the gameplay as addictive, claiming it rivaled the mighty Tetris in terms of being easy to pick up but hard to put down. The integration of Pokémon themes was also praised for adding layers to what could have just been a boring old puzzler, and on the whole, Puzzle Challenge was heralded as an example of what handheld gaming is all about. It's in the elite group of games to receive over 90% on game rankings. In fact, we had to nerf its position in this list slightly, it being only a puzzle game. I mean, hats off to it, of course, but I think we all know that a 9 out of 10 puzzle game is still not as good as a 9 out of 10 RPG. We hope you understand. Still, when you think about all the other games this plucky underdog has beaten in this list, you can't help but be impressed. Number 15. Pokémon Pearl DS. It's all classic Pokémon titles from here on out, folks, and what we have here is the first Pokémon game that this list's writer ever got to play. He says he'll try not to let that factor into things, but he's also said he's making no promises. Set in Sinnoh, a region based on the Japanese island of Hokkaido, Pokémon Diamond and Pearl begins in a similar fashion to Ruby and Sapphire. Player is snooping around in the woods, player gets attacked by a rogue Pokémon, player chooses from 3 starters to fend it off. This time around, the choices are Chimchar, a fire monkey, Piplup, a water penguin, and Turtwig, a Anyone got any idea what Turtwig is? Once they've chosen their monkey/penguin/something, players embark on a journey through one of the most richly realized lands in Pokémon history. As well as the classic towns and cities, there are also the natural landmarks like the 3 lakes, each one home to a legendary guardian, and Sinnoh Underground, a huge network of interconnecting tunnels and caves. Combined with over 100 new Pokémon, only some of whom were a bit naff, this quickly earned Diamond and Pearl a lot of admirers. They liked the graphics, the engaging, if somewhat formulaic story, and the Wi-Fi connectivity, allowing you to play Pokémon with your friends without having to root around for that stupid link cable. Brilliant! Now all I have to root around for is some friends. Number 14. Pokémon Diamond DS. As much as it breaks our writer's heart to admit it, the general consensus online is that Diamond is the better game. Stupid internet. Those are his words, not mine, and that's you he's talking about, you know. As well as the exclusive Larvitar, Aron, and Cranidos evolutionary lines, Diamond was also home to the mighty Dialga, the game's cover star, which was deemed superior to Pearl's equivalent, Palkia. Dialga is supposed to represent the concept of time, as opposed to Palkia's space. I mean, space is cool and all that, but come on, this is the Pokémon equivalent of Marty McFly we're talking about here. As the first mainline Pokémon games for a handheld with 2 screens, Diamond and Pearl went to great lengths to exploit this newfound real estate. Whilst the top screen is devoted solely to displaying the game, the bottom screen is given over to the Pokétech, an in-game device with multiple useful functions. These include a digital watch, a notepad, a move effectiveness checker, a dowsing machine for finding hidden items, and a calculator. I'm not really sure why you'd need to do sums while fighting Team Galactic, but hey, it's nice to have the option, I suppose. Though its story wasn't massively different to what had come before it, Diamond and Pearl brought enough new material into the fold to be regarded as a huge leap forward for the franchise. There's a reason why we've already seen 2 remakes and a prequel for this game on the list. People just love it that damn much. Number 13. Pokémon Yellow, Game Boy. 1 year on from the launch of the first Pokémon games in 1996, the first series of the Pokémon anime TV show premiered in Japan. The adventures of Ash Ketchum and his friends Brock and Misty, who don't have surnames for some reason, quickly won over a huge audience, so Nintendo were keen to translate this success into the land of video games. Enter Pokémon Yellow, a game designed to more closely reflect what fans of the anime were seeing on screen. The main way it did that was by removing the choice of a starter Pokémon and instead pairing them up with a sassy Pikachu, just like with Ash on the show, only with fewer random electrocutions. Other than this, plus a few extra characters designed to resemble those in the anime, the gameplay of Pokémon Yellow doesn't bring much new to the party, which is why it's placed beneath Red and Blue on our countdown. Putting out Yellow when they did was a huge risk for Nintendo, as the second generation of Pokémon, Gold and Silver, were scheduled to come out later that same year. Whilst Yellow definitely didn't sell as well as those games or the original generation, it was still well received by critics, who enjoyed the novelty of having the delightful mascot follow you around in the overworld. Nintendo probably couldn't pull a stunt like this today, but back in the late 90s, it was fair game, apparently. Number 12. Pokémon Heart Gold, DS. For our final set of remakes, we turn the clock back to the second generation of Pokémon and the annoyingly named Heart Gold and Soul Silver. What, they couldn't think of another word beginning with G to fit with the alliteration? How about glittering gold? I came up with that in 3 seconds and it's already better. As with all the remakes, the core story here doesn't stray too far from what the players had experienced in the original versions. At this point in time, the narrative was quite simple, but players didn't seem to mind reliving a basic yet highly enthralling ride through Johto. The redos came with a few new features though, including one of the most bizarre accessories in the franchise history. The Poke Walker was a pedometer in the shape of a Pokeball that players could transfer creatures from their game over to. Then they could take their friends for a walk, earning points called Watts, which could be exchanged for in-game rewards. Could this be considered a precursor to Pokemon Go? No, of course it couldn't. What a stupid thing to ask. Aside from this, and the ability to have a preferred partner tail you, Yellow style, there weren't many other differences between the rebooted titles and their forebears. A new minigame was introduced where players could use the DS touchscreen to compete in running races, but does anyone really care about that? Thank God that Heart Gold and Soul Silver were based on such strong source material. Otherwise, they may not have done quite so well. Number 11. Pokémon Soul Silver, DS. In this battle of the matched pairs, it's Soul Silver that comes out on top, and not just because it understood the assignment when it came to its name. While some fans may have preferred to get their hands on Ho-Oh, Heart Gold's cover star, Soul Silver not only boasted Lugia, a cool flying dragon thing that got its own movie, but it was also home to fan-favourite exclusives like Meowth, Skarmory, and Vulpix. Reviewers went absolutely crackers for these games, reveling in the chance to play a classic Pokémon title on the most advanced handheld available at the time. Official Nintendo magazine called them the best Pokémon games yet, although I would say they probably had a vested interest in making Nintendo's latest product look good. In all honesty, we think these games only succeeded because the ones they were based on were so good to begin with. As you're about to find out, the original Gold and Silver performed very well, and getting the chance to play them again with better graphics and more polished performance was enough on its own to make people very, very happy. Whilst we could have knocked some points off for the lack of interesting innovation shown by Heart Gold and Soul Silver, it's hard not to admire something that was so well received despite the titles putting comparatively little effort in. It's like that kid at school who never revised for exams but got all A stars anyway. They don't deserve any of the rewards they got, but you've got to admire the hustle, you know? Number 10. Pokémon Black, DS. You can't have a Black and White 2 without a Black and White 1, and here they are, several places above their sequels. Think of Black and White 2 as the son of Mask to Black and White 1's The Mask. Okay, no, that was a bit harsh, they're not that bad. With either a Snivy, Tepig, or Oshawott by their side, players must negotiate the many pitfalls of the Unova region, including the efforts of Team Plasma, who believe that Pokémon are oppressed by humans and should be set free. To be fair, I think they might have a point here. Plasma's plan involves capturing one of a pair of legendaries. In Black, their target is Reshiram, who is white, and in white, it's Zekrom, who is black. No, that's not confusing at all. As well as a seasonal cycle, which affects some Pokemon's appearance, Black and White also introduced new battle types, new wild encounters, and 156 new entries into the Pokédex, a series record at the time. All of these improvements helped endear Black and White to the Pocket Monsters faithful. They became just the 15th game in history to be awarded a perfect score by Famitsu, the others obviously being 14 different ports of Ride to Hell Retribution, with many more coming out and saying that they were their favourites in the franchise so far. Obviously not everyone said that, otherwise they'd be at numbers 1 and 2 in the list, but certainly enough people said it to earn them a spot in the top 10. Number 9. Pokémon White, DS. In the race for control of this landmark period in Poke history, it's the lighter shade that leads the way. Whilst the disparities between games have been small in most matched pairs that we've come across so far, there's actually one huge factor here that tips the scales in White's favour. It's got more Pokémon in it. Anyone who plays through Black will come across the exclusive area Black City, a futuristic metropolis home to a vast array of special items and trainers to fight. Conversely, you have White Forest, a serene wooded setting where players can add Pokémon to their arsenal that simply aren't available in the other game. There's a lot of them as well, 32 in fact, including favourites like Pidgey, Ghastly, and Togepi. When the name of the series is literally Pokémon, and one game has more Pokémon in it than the other, there really can't be any complaints about putting it first. Fair play to this generation for being the most diverse yet across both games, but all this did really was condemn Pokémon Black to a lifetime of inferiority. Still, when inferiority nets you the title of 10th best Pokémon game of all time, it's hardly the end of the world, is it? Number 8. Pokémon X, 3DS. Fans were worried that Nintendo and Game Freak had finally run out of ideas for titles when the 6th generation of games were called Pokémon X and Y. Man, I can't wait for Pokémon something and something else to come out next year. Thankfully though, this trend of bad names didn't continue, and despite this glaring fault, X and Y turned out to be exceptional games. Kalos is the chosen location for this round of action, a region based on Europe, but mostly France. In the game, you'll find Pokémon versions of established landmarks like the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, and that most iconic of French sites, giant piles of rubbish in the street because the bin men are on strike again. Ooh la la indeed. Receiving either a Chespin, a Fennekin, or a Froakie, which eventually evolves into the very popular Greninja, players then have to travel across the star-shaped land, where they will eventually uncover the sinister secrets behind Mega Evolution, a feature first introduced in this generation. Mega Evolution has carried over into future titles and is now an integral part of the series, even if it confuses old fogies like me. This wasn't the only mainstay that first appeared in X and Y though, as Fairy became the first new Pokémon type since the days of Gold and Silver. Pokémon X loses out here because of its weaker selection of exclusives and Mega Evolved forms, but in terms of great Pokémon games, X most certainly does mark the spot. Number 7. Pokémon Y, 3DS. Why? Here's what... Actually, better not. Might get sued or beaten up by the nicest man in the world. X and Y's legendary Pokémons, Pokemon, are the deer-shaped Xerneas and the horrible nightmare bird-shaped Yveltal. There's not much difference between these two, except for in the will make you wet the bed department, but in terms of Mega Evolutions, it's a different story. Of the two version-specific evolutions, Charizard and Mewtwo, Y's options came out on top. Whilst Mega Charizard X looks way cooler than Mega Charizard Y, both it and Mega Mewtwo Y pale in comparison to their alternative forms. But seriously, can we take another look at Charizard X? Both games made the most of their journey to the land of 3D graphics, as well as offering a wider range of Pokémon available in the early stages of play and a smoother experience when battling friends online. New battle types were also introduced, set in mid-air and against hordes of wild Pokémon, but reception towards these was mixed. What went down better though was the option to customize the player character, finally adding some personality to this drab and dreary protagonist. X and Y might not have the same cult status as some of their cousins, but players who were there for it at the start will no doubt have very fond memories of Kalos, Mega Evolution, and finally being able to afford that hat they'd been saving up for. Number 6. Pokémon Moon, 3DS. No, Pokémon Moon is not a game where you and a group of strange creatures go out and flash your bum at people. That is, however, my regular Friday night routine. Did I say that out loud? Disregard that information. Instead, Pokémon Moon is one half of the 7th generation of flagship Pokémon titles, releasing for the 3DS worldwide in 2016. Based on the Hawaiian Islands, the Alola region serves as a beautiful home for the action, where players must once again travel around and defeat gym leaders to... Wait, hang on, what? No gym leaders? This is an outrage! Why did they change that? Worst game ever! Rational people saw the move away from gym battles and towards a series of varied tasks called the Island Challenge, which is presented as a rite of passage for any Alolan turning 11, as a good thing, a much-needed shake-up in a formula that was 2 decades old by this point. Another big shift came with the introduction of regional forms. These were established Pokémon with different appearances and abilities based on the environment in which they lived. Also brought in were Z moves, a type of special attack, and a smart Pokédex inhabited by a Pokémon called Rotom. Hopefully it doesn't mind being in there, otherwise this game just got a great deal darker. With so many new features to talk about and the actual story to summarize too, it's a good thing we've given ourselves 2 entries to discuss these truly revolutionary Pokémon games. Shall we move on? Number 5, Pokémon Sun, 3DS. In the War of the Celestial Bodies, Pokémon Sun comes out just ahead of Pokémon Moon. You could say that the difference was night and day. What? What do you mean that pun doesn't work if they're very similar? The plot of Sun and Moon features not one, but 2 groups of antagonists. First up, there's Team Skull, who... like skulls, perhaps. And then there's the Ether Foundation, who are out to harness the power of creatures from another dimension called Ultra Beasts. Seriously, between jumping across worlds and ditching gym battles, this game has zero chill. Critics were over the moon and sun with so much about these games, from the gripping story and the varied gameplay to the more grounded graphics. It's not without its flaws, though. There are way too many tutorials in the opening sections, for example, but that's only because these games try to cram 20 years worth of innovation into one title, so cut them a bit of slack, will ya? This was one of the harder generations to pick a winner in, but based on the fact that you mostly play Moon at nighttime, owing to the in-game clock running 12 hours ahead of real time, we opted for the shinier and brighter world of Pokémon Sun. What can I say? I guess we're just optimists here at Team TripleJump. Also, the legendary for Pokémon Sun is a flipping psychic lion, and what's Moon got? Some weird bat thing. Yeah, nice try, mate. Sun wins by a mile. Number 4, Pokémon Blue/Green, Game Boy. We finally made it, everyone. The games that started it all. The entire reason this list exists, and why so many of us got into debt as teenagers buying stupidly expensive trading cards and plush toys. May I introduce to you, hailing from the Game Boy in 1996, Pokémon Red and Blue, and Green in Japan instead of Blue, but we don't speak Japanese. Honestly, I'm a little lost for words even talking about these two titles. How do you do justice to a series that started not only one of the biggest video gaming franchises of all time, but also the highest grossing franchise in all of media history? At the time of writing, Pokémon as a whole has made more money than Harry Potter, Star Wars, Marvel, and even Mickey Goddamn Mouse, and it's all really thanks to this pair of plucky little cartridges right here. Everyone who has even remotely heard of Pokémon will know the story of Red and Blue. You meet Professor Oak, choose a Bulbasaur, Squirtle, or the correct answer, Charmander, and then you're off, free to explore the Kanto region and meet its many exciting and terrifying inhabitants. All the tropes and traits we've discussed multiple times throughout this list, the gym battles, the team of baddies, the legendaries, they all stemmed from this first generation. With over 31 million copies sold worldwide, they're amongst the best-selling video games ever, and there is simply no way to choose which one is better. Except this is a list, so that's exactly what we had to do. So Blue is here, and at number 3, Pokémon Red, Game Boy. Oh boy, why do I feel like we've just reignited a debate that should have died off decades ago in the playgrounds of 90s schools? Look, we had to pick one, and based on the research we conducted online, oh yeah, we've got stats to back this up, the general chatter suggests that Red is better. We could try and justify this decision by saying that Red had the better exclusives, or that it ran better, or that Red is a better color than Blue because blood is thicker than water or something, but really, is there any point in trying? Choosing between these two is like choosing between one grandparent and your identical but slightly different coloured grandparent. Without them, you wouldn't be here, and any superficial contrasts between the two, like one grandparent always giving you Mars bars while the other always gives you Twixes, are utterly irrelevant because they both give you loads of money at Christmas. This metaphor may have gotten away from me slightly. What were we talking about? Yes, Pokémon. Critics at the time thought they'd hit the jackpot. Here was a new franchise with simple mechanics, a strong story, varied locations, and a roster of bright, colourful characters that you were encouraged to go out and find. Even when the game was over, you still hadn't completed Pokémon until you'd caught them all, and that was so exciting. Even after all of these years, Red and Blue stand up as two of the most important games in history, and through a combination of nostalgia, the anime, and nerds like us incessantly bringing them up, these old-timers still hold a very special place in the hearts of so many. Number 2, Pokémon Gold, Game Boy Color. Red and Blue were great, but sometimes you just can't beat a sequel. 3 years after the primary coloured pals set the world ablaze, Pokémon Gold and Silver were released with the unenviable task of succeeding two of the most beloved titles ever made. After being given either a Cyndaquil, Chikorita, or Totodile from Professor Elm, players pay a visit to good old Professor Oak, who sneakily slips them a Pokédex. That's not a euphemism. Elm agrees to let you keep your chosen starter for your upcoming adventure before presumably finding Oak and smacking him for giving such an important tool to some punk kid. The number of vital innovations these games made is off the scale. These were the first Pokémon games to have legendaries on the cover, Ho-Oh on Gold and Lugia on Silver. They allowed for the holding of items for the first time, the use of an internal clock to influence the environment, the catching of shinies, the breeding of Pokémon. Okay, I got a bit more excited about that than I should have done, but still. As well as all this, Gold and Silver played like a dream. The action was still fresh and exciting, except now players could access 100 new Pokémon and, here's the kicker, they could travel back into Kanto once the main quest was over, essentially letting them replay the first game all over again. We had to pick one of the two to be the best though. In terms of real-world precious metals, Gold may be the best, but when it comes to Pokémon games, we feel the top prize has to go to...
Number 1. Pokémon Silver, Game Boy Color. Of all the Pokémon games across every platform, the one with the highest combined review score in either Metacritic or game rankings is Pokémon Silver with a whopping 91%. The second highest is Pokémon Puzzle Challenge, but we've already been over why that isn't in the top 5. The counterpart to Pokémon Gold, Silver is the second take on the player's journey round Johto, back through Kanto, and then into the depths of Mount Silver, where they will come face to face with iconic trainer Red for the most epic battle in Pokémon history up to that point.
Aside from version-exclusive Pokémon, the main differences between the two are that in Gold you get Ho-Oh first and then Lugia, whilst it's the other way around in Silver. Which one you prefer will probably depend on which one you saw first as a kid, the first episode of the anime or Pokémon the Movie 2000. Despite the aforementioned higher review score though, it's hard to separate these two. Both brought so many essential parts of the franchise together, both sold tens of millions of versions worldwide, and both proved that this craze of catching pocket-sized monsters was not just a passing fad.
Both Gold and Silver are among some of the greatest games, Pokémon or otherwise, ever to grace a console, and there's a reason why they're still talked about to this very day.
Now, if you'll excuse us, we think we'll dig out our matching Game Boy colours and boot up an old classic. It's time to catch 'em all.